Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the first part of What If Deku Had a Super Ice Quirk. All credit for this story goes to the original authors, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. The sun was setting on a warm summer evening, casting long shadows across the playground where young Midoriya and Bakugo played. They were only 4 years old, but their lives were already shaped by the extraordinary world they were born into. The playground, usually bustling with laughter and activity, was quiet at this hour, with only a few children scattered about. Midoriya and Bakugo, both small and full of energy, were playing on the swings, their legs pumping back and forth as they soared into the air. Their laughter echoed in the empty space, a testament to their carefree childhood. It was a rare moment of peace before their lives would take a turn that would define their futures. Midoriya had always admired Bakugo's boundless energy and fierce determination. The two had been friends since they were toddlers, and despite their different personalities, they shared a deep bond. Today was special because both had just awakened their quirks, marking the beginning of their journey toward becoming heroes. Bakugo's quirk, Explosion, had manifested in a burst of fiery sparks that had left Midoriya awestruck. Bakugo had been thrilled, his usual bravado even more pronounced as he demonstrated his newfound power. In contrast, Midoriya's quirk, Cryokinesis, had been a subtle but undeniable presence. As they played, their conversation turned to their dreams. Midoriya, eyes shining with excitement, turned to Bakugo. "When we're older, we're going to be heroes, right?" Bakugo grinned, his eyes gleaming with the same fierce determination that would later define him. "Of course. We'll be the best heroes ever. I'll be the #1 hero, and you'll be right there with me." Midoriya's heart swelled at Bakugo's words. They had always shared a vision of the future, but hearing it spoken so confidently made it feel more real. "Yeah. We'll fight villains and save people. It'll be awesome." Bakugo's gaze softened for a moment, and he placed a hand on Midoriya's shoulder. "We'll do it together, no matter what. No one will stand in our way." The promise they made that evening was more than just words, it was a vow that would guide their actions and decisions for years to come. They were young, but their dreams were grand, and their determination was unwavering. They imagined themselves as heroes, fighting side by side, and nothing seemed impossible. The memory was a bittersweet one for Midoriya. It was a reminder of the bond they had once shared, a bond that had been strained and fractured over the years. The promise they made as children now felt like a distant echo, overshadowed by the conflicts and misunderstandings that had come between them. Yet, as he looked back on that moment, Midoriya felt a pang of nostalgia. He remembered the purity of their dreams and the strength of their friendship. It was a reminder of what had once been and what could still be, a glimmer of hope that, despite everything, the future might still hold a chance for reconciliation. In the quiet of the park, as the evening grew darker and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Midoriya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The promise he and Bakugo had made as children was not just a memory, it was a testament to their shared aspirations and the bond that had once defined them. And even if the path to heroism had become more complicated, the spirit of that promise would continue to guide him forward. The years passed quickly, each one marked by the steady progression of childhood into adolescence. For Midoriya, each year brought new challenges and changes, but one constant remained: Bakugo Katsuki, his first and best friend. Their bond had started strong and full of promise, but as time went on, it began to fray at the edges. 5 years old. The bond between Midoriya and Bakugo was as solid as ever. They were inseparable, often seen together at the park or in their neighborhood, their laughter ringing out as they played. Their quirks, still new and exciting, were a source of endless fascination and joy. Bakugo's fiery explosions were tempered by Midoriya's icy touch. They were a dynamic duo if you asked anyone. They dreamed together of becoming heroes, their shared aspirations cementing their friendship. 7 years old. By the time they were 7, the world outside their bubble started to intrude. Bakugo's quirk had gotten him attention and praise from friends and teachers. He could do no wrong according to the teacher, he took to the attention like a fish to water. Midoriya, who was receiving that same attention, didn't like it to say the least. When he wasn't hanging with his Quirk, no one could find him. Bakugo began to assert himself more aggressively, his once playful demeanor giving way to a harsher, more demanding attitude. Despite this, Midoriya remained loyal, trying to understand his friend's changing behavior. They still spent time together, but their interactions were increasingly punctuated by Bakugo's outbursts and Midoriya's attempts to defuse them. 10 years old. As they entered elementary school, Bakugo's behavior took a darker turn. His desire to be the best had become an obsession, and his belief in being superior to the other extras, and he began to view Midoriya's quirk with disdain. Midoriya's ice manipulation, once admired, was now seen as a hindrance to their shared goals. Bakugo's bullying tactics extended beyond their personal interactions, never affecting Midoriya beyond the occasional hurtful word, as he began to target others who he deemed weaker. Midoriya, despite feeling hurt by Bakugo's harsh words and actions to the other students, remained by his side. The loyalty and promise they made as children kept him from walking away, even as the friendship he cherished seemed to crumble. 12 years old. By the time they were 12, Bakugo's behavior had become almost unbearable. His mean streak had intensified, and he had become known for his volatile temper and aggressive demeanor. Midoriya didn't usually receive his ire. Bakugo viewed him as his only equal and treated him as such. Despite Bakugo's treatment of the other students, Midoriya continued to stand by Bakugo, driven by a sense of obligation and the hope that his friend might change. Their interactions were marked by frequent arguments and confrontations, but Midoriya's unwavering support never wavered. 14 years old. As they entered junior high, Bakugo's bullying became more systematic. His actions were no longer confined to outbursts but had evolved into calculated efforts to undermine and humiliate those around him, never including Midoriya. He would throw things at him in class, leave spiteful notes on desks, and actively sabotage other students' efforts to fit in. Every rude action of Bakugo tugged at Midoriya's conscience, but he and Bakugo had been friends for years. Midoriya couldn't leave him now. Throughout the years, Midoriya's loyalty to Bakugo was both a source of strength and a point of profound sadness. The boy he had once admired and loved as a brother had transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. Yet, Midoriya clung to the hope that somewhere beneath the layers of bitterness and anger, the friend he once knew still existed. Even as Bakugo grew meaner and more distant, Midoriya continued to hold on to their shared dream of becoming heroes. He was determined not to let go of the friendship that had once meant so much to him, even as it was increasingly tested by Bakugo's harsh and unrelenting behavior. The journey was painful, filled with moments of doubt and heartache, but Midoriya's unwavering commitment to their promise remained the guiding light through the darkness. In the quiet moments of reflection, Midoriya would sometimes recall their childhood promise, a beacon of hope that perhaps, someday, the bond they once shared could be rekindled. Despite the odds, he refused to give up on Bakugo, driven by the belief that true friendship could withstand even the harshest trials. It was the second week of 7th grade, and the air in the classroom was abuzz with chatter as Mrs. Takahashi entered, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she cleared her throat, silencing the students. "Settle down, everyone," she said curtly, her tone lacking warmth. "We have a new student joining us today." She gestured towards the door, and a small girl with delicate features and long black hair tied in a ponytail stepped into the room. Her eyes, large and dark, darted nervously around the class before fixing on the floor. "This is Aiko Tanaka," Mrs. Takahashi continued, her voice tinged with an almost imperceptible disdain. "She's just moved to Mizutofu, and, as you can see, she is quirkless." The word hung in the air, the teacher's tone making it sound more like a flaw than a simple fact. The class murmured, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled contempt. Midoriya felt a pang of empathy for Aiko as he watched her shift uncomfortably under the scrutiny of her new classmates. Mrs. Takahashi offered no further encouragement or support, instead waving dismissively toward an empty seat at the back. "Take your seat, Tanaka." Aiko nodded quickly and hurried to the back of the room, keeping her head down. Midoriya, seated a few rows away, caught her eye for a brief moment, offering her a small, encouraging smile. She didn't return it, her gaze quickly dropping back to the desk. As Mrs. Takahashi droned on with the lesson, Midoriya's thoughts lingered on Aiko. The cold, indifferent welcome she'd received reminded him of how harsh people could be to those who were different. And in this world, being quirkless was the ultimate difference. Days later, Midoriya had been heading to class early in lunch as he normally did when he was unable to find Bakugo, but before he entered his class he saw Bakugo and his lackeys drawing things on Aiko's desk. He'd been too far away to see what was being written, but he saw Bakugo and his lackeys laughing. It hurt his soul to watch, more than usual at least. He'd been pulling away from Bakugo for a while now, slowly but surely. When they finally left room, Midoriya started to wipe off the desk. He was almost done when Aiko walked in. She said nothing as sat at her desk while Midoriya continued to wipe off the desk. Midoriya walked away quietly when he finished, getting a small, barely audible thanks you from Aiko. He said nothing in response. Midoriya continued to observe in growing horror as Bakugo and his lackeys began their relentless campaign against the girl. It started small, with cruel words, mocking laughter, and continuing with writing on her desk that followed her wherever she went. The insults were laced with venom, each one aimed at tearing down the girl's spirit. Midoriya wanted to intervene, but something held him back: fear, uncertainty, and the lingering hope that maybe it would stop on its own. But it didn't stop. By the second day, the bullying escalated to physical attacks. Bakugo shoved her in the hallway, sending her sprawling to the floor as his friends laughed. They started cornering her after school, pushing her into walls, and singeing her uniform with blasts from Bakugo's quirk. Midoriya could see the burns on her arms and the bruises on her legs. Each day, she left from school with a new injury, and each day, Midoriya's guilt grew. He found himself trailing behind her after school, waiting until Bakugo was done tormenting her so he could help her up and offer what little comfort he could. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered on the third day as Midoriya applied a bandage to a particularly nasty burn on her wrist. Her voice was small, barely audible, and it broke something inside him. He should be doing more. He should be stopping this. "I don't know," he said shortly, kneeling beside her. She flinched at first but relaxed slightly after a bit of it. No other words are said throughout the process, but she didn't pull away when Midoriya gently took her hand. He winced at the sight of the burn on her wrist, a telltale sign of Bakugo's quirk. The skin was red and raw, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out as he inspected it. Midoriya said nothing, digging into his backpack. He always carried a small first aid kit, something he'd picked up from his mother, who had always been overly cautious. He pulled out some ointment and a bandage, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. "This will help." The girl watched him silently as he applied the ointment and carefully wrapped the bandage around her wrist. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude, and for a moment, Midoriya felt a surge of anger toward Bakugo. How could someone he had once admired be so cruel? "Thank you," she whispered when he was done, her voice barely audible. Midoriya didn't respond, unsure of why he didn't stop Bakugo. Inside he was conflicted. He should be doing more. He should be stopping this. The third day was worse. Bakugo and his lackeys cornered the girl in the gym, away from the prying eyes of teachers. They knocked her to the ground, laughing as she tried to shield herself from their blows. Midoriya not far behind Bakugo. Midoriya looked dejected, unable to even look at Bakugo and his lackeys bullying Aiko, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the tears streaming down her face and the way she curled into a ball to protect herself. When it was over and the boys had left, Midoriya stayed moving to her side. She was sitting up now, her arms wrapped around her knees as she sobbed quietly. There was a bruise forming on her cheek, dark and angry against her pale skin. "Let me see," Midoriya said gently, crouching beside her. She hesitated but eventually turned her face toward him. The bruise was bad, and there were small cuts on her arms from where she had been pushed against the rough gym floor. "Why do you hang out with him?" he murmured as he reached for his first aid kit again. "We're friends," was Midoriya's only response. "He's a bad person," Aiko says quietly. "No, he's not," Midoriya quickly snaps, trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince Aiko. "He beat my ass because he's such a good person," Aiko says half sarcastically and half angrily. Midoriya, who's always known that Bakugo was a bad person and buried that fact deep inside of himself, says nothing, knowing he's been beat. She didn't say much more, she just watched him with those same wide eyes as he tended to her wounds. As he worked, Midoriya's mind raced. He couldn't let this go on. Bakugo was going too far, and the girl was suffering for it. But what could he do? Confronting Bakugo meant risking everything: their friendship, his safety, and maybe even more. "You don't have to," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Midoriya looked up, startled. She was watching him intently as if she could see the turmoil in his mind. "You don't have to help me." Midoriya shook his head. "I know," he said firmly. She blinked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. For a moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Midoriya finished bandaging her arms and sat back, unsure of what else to say. "Thank you," she said again, and this time, there was a hint of a smile on her lips. It was small and sad, but it was something. Midoriya smiled back, but the guilt in his chest only grew. He couldn't keep pretending this was enough. The bandages and ointment were temporary fixes for a much bigger problem. Bakugo was becoming more dangerous, and Midoriya knew that if he didn't do something soon, the girl would get seriously hurt. Midoriya walked Aiko home that day, both of them silent through the entire walk. By the fourth day, things had reached a breaking point. Midoriya found Bakugo and his lackeys in the alley behind the school, surrounding the girl. She was on her knees, her body trembling as Bakugo loomed over her, a sneer twisting his features. Midoriya could what Bakugo was saying, but he didn't need to. The look of sheer terror on the girl's face told him everything. Bakugo's voice was sharp, filled with the usual arrogance that made her skin crawl. "Where do you think you're going?" Aiko froze, her breath hitching. She didn't want a confrontation, but there was no avoiding it now. She turned slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm just going home," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. Bakugo took a few steps towards her, his lackeys close behind him, sneering as they always did when they smelled fear. "Don't walk away. After all, we're friends, right?" His tone was mocking, dripping with sarcasm. Aiko's grip on her backpack tightened. "I just want to go home, Bakugo. Please, just leave me alone." But Bakugo wasn't interested in letting her go so easily. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space, and for a moment, Aiko could feel the heat radiating off him. His quirk was always simmering just below the surface, a constant threat that he used to keep others in line. "What's your problem, huh?" Bakugo's voice was low, dangerous. "You think you're too good to talk to me now?" Aiko shook her head, trying to stay calm. "No, it's not like that." Before she could finish her sentence, Bakugo's hand shot out, grabbing her by the shoulder. The sudden movement startled her, and she gasped as she felt his palm begin to heat up, the air around it growing thick and warm. "I don't like it when people look down on me," Bakugo hissed, his grip tightening. A small explosion crackled in his hand, the heat searing through Aiko's uniform and into her skin. She winced, the pain sharp and immediate, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. "Stop, Bakugo," she pleaded, her voice strained. But Bakugo only smirked, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You're quirkless, Aiko. That means you don't get to ignore me. You don't get to act like you're better than anyone here. You're nothing." The pain intensified as the explosion left a burn on her shoulder, the fabric of her uniform beginning to smoke. Aiko couldn't hold back a small cry of pain as tears welled up in her eyes. The burn wasn't deep, but it was enough to leave a mark, a physical reminder of Bakugo's cruelty. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he had to do something, but the fear was paralyzing. What if Bakugo turned on him? What if he couldn't stop him? But then he saw the tears streaming down the girl's face, and something inside him snapped. Without thinking, Midoriya, shaking off his shock, stepped forward. The temperature around him plummeted, the warm afternoon air turning frigid in an instant. Frost began to spread from his feet, creeping across the ground like a living thing. Bakugo and his lackeys turned to face him, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion and then to something approaching fear. "Leave her alone," Midoriya said, his voice colder than the air around him. He took another step forward, the frost spreading faster now, coating the walls and the ground in a thin layer of ice. "Or you'll regret it." Bakugo stared at him, his red eyes narrowing. For a moment, Midoriya thought he might attack anyway, but then he saw the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty in Bakugo's gaze. The cold was starting to bite at their skin, their breath misting in front of them. "What are you going to do?" Bakugo spat, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Freeze us?" "If I have to," Midoriya replied. His hands were at his sides, but they were trembling with the effort it took to keep his quirk under control. He knew if he pushed it too far, if he let the cold seep into their bodies, it could cause real damage. But he didn't care. Not anymore. The lackeys were the first to back down. One by one, they stepped away, shivering as they moved away from the encroaching frost. Midoriya didn't take his eyes off Bakugo and didn't let the cold relent. Last chance, Kaken. For a moment, it seemed like Bakugo might push back. His hands sparked with tiny explosions, and his glare was fierce. But then he huffed, letting the sparks fizzle out. "Tch. She's not worth it," he muttered, turning away. Midoriya watched as Bakugo walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. The cold lingered for a moment longer, until Bakugo was out of sight, and then Midoriya let it go. The frost began to melt, leaving the ground wet and slippery. He turned to the girl, his heart aching at the sight of her. She was still on her knees, her body trembling from both fear and the cold. "Are you okay?" Midoriya asked, kneeling beside her. He reached out a hand, but she flinched away, her eyes wide with fear. It took a moment before she realized that Midoriya wasn't there to hurt her, and she slowly reached out to take his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. Midoriya helped her to her feet, feeling the weight of what had just happened settling on him. He had crossed a line today, one that he knew he could never uncross. Whatever friendship he had left with Bakugo was gone, shattered in the cold. But as he walked the girl home, making sure she was safe after doing his best to care for her burn, he knew it was worth it. He had done the right thing, even if it meant losing a friend. Even if it meant gaining an enemy. That night, Midoriya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in his mind over and over. He had stood up to Bakugo, and it had worked. But the memory of Bakugo's glare, the anger and betrayal in his eyes, haunted him. He had lost something important today. But as he closed his eyes, he thought of the girl's tearful thank you and the way her hand had trembled in his. He knew he had made the right choice. Tomorrow, everything would be different. But for today, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of victory. Midoriya would protect the people who needed it, even if it meant standing against those who had once been his friends. Even if it meant standing alone. The days following Midoriya's decision to stand by Aiko were anything but peaceful. The tension between him and Bakugo had reached a boiling point, and the rest of the class could feel it. Whispers followed Midoriya wherever he went, eyes watching his every move. When Midoriya started to slowly grow away from Bakugo, he became a more solitary figure at school. It wasn't that he didn't like people, mostly, but more that he found comfort in the quiet spaces where he could think, observe, and just be. The hustle and bustle of the schoolyard, the loud laughter and boisterous energy of his classmates, it all felt a bit too much for him sometimes. So, he sought out the quiet corners of the school, the places where he could escape from the noise and chaos. That's why it didn't surprise anyone when Midoriya spent most of his time alone. He wasn't unpopular, just distant. If he wanted to, he could be very popular. He doesn't though, so he would sit in the farthest corners of the classroom, close to the window, or eat his lunch in places where few people ventured. It was his way of staying out of sight, out of mind. But that began to change when Aiko Tanaka arrived. It had only been a few weeks since Aiko had joined their class, but it felt like a lifetime to Midoriya. He had watched as the other students quickly singled her out. She was quirkless, and in a society that valued quirks above all else, that made her an easy target. The first day had been just whispers and pointed looks, but by the second and third days, it had escalated to something more physical: bruises on her arms, burns on her hands. And Bakugo was at the center of it all, his lackeys following his lead as they tormented her. Midoriya had never felt so conflicted. He knew what Bakugo was capable of, he'd seen it firsthand. But seeing the extent of the cruelty directed at Aiko had shaken something loose inside him. He wanted to intervene, but he also knew what it would mean for him if he did. Associating with a quirkless girl was social suicide. Not that he had much to lose, but he liked the option to be popular if he wanted, especially in a school where status was everything. But he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Midoriya had had enough. He had spent the previous days quietly helping ᴡᴇ after school, finding her in the shadows of the playground or behind the school building, where she would retreat to lick her wounds in solitude. He would approach her carefully, offering bandages for her bruises, ointment for her burns. She never spoke much, but the gratitude in her eyes was enough. He would carefully clean her wounds, his hands gentle as he applied the ointment and wrapped the bandages. The first time, she had flinched away from him, distrustful and afraid. But as the days passed, she began to trust him more, relaxing under his touch. They didn't talk much during these times. Midoriya wasn't sure what to say, and ᴡᴇ seemed content with the silence. But in those moments, a bond began to form between them. Midoriya couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that settled over him like a heavy blanket. He knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of Bakugo's anger, to feel powerless and alone. And while he had a quirk to fall back on, ᴡᴇ had nothing. When the lunch bell rang, Midoriya found his eyes drift over to ᴡᴇ and the crowd of students pouring out of the classrooms. He spotted her near the edge of the playground, clutching her lunchbox tightly to her chest as she looked for a place to sit. A group of girls walked past her, giggling and whispering to each other, and ᴡᴇ's shoulders hunched slightly, as if trying to make herself smaller. Midoriya took a deep breath and walked over to her. "Hey, ᴡᴇ," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the din of the playground. She looked up at him, surprise flickering in her dark eyes. She still had that wary look about her, like she was expecting him to be just another person waiting to hurt her. "Do you want to eat lunch with me today?" he asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. ᴡᴇ hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out and tell her it was a joke. But when she saw the sincerity in Midoriya's eyes, she nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at her lips. Midoriya led her to his favorite spot, a secluded area behind the school building where the trees formed a natural canopy overhead. It was quiet there, away from the noise and prying eyes of the other students. He had always liked this spot, finding solace in its tranquility. It was a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, but today, he didn't mind sharing it with ᴡᴇ. They sat down on the grass, and ᴡᴇ cautiously opened her lunchbox. Midoriya noticed that she ate in small, careful bites, as if she was trying not to attract any attention. He, on the other hand, found himself more focused on her than on his own lunch. ᴡᴇ started. "Thank you for getting me out of there," she said quietly. "It's no problem," Midoriya responded. He was originally content to eat in silence, now felt he had to continue the conversation, his voice tentative. "I noticed you've been keeping to yourself." ᴡᴇ looked up at him, her expression guarded. "I don't really have a choice," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Midoriya nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "Yeah, I get that. It's probably very hard." She didn't reply, but the way her gaze softened told him that she appreciated his understanding. Midoriya continued, offering her a small smile. "I like being alone sometimes, but it's different when you don't have a choice. It's lonely." ᴡᴇ's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a connection between them, an understanding that went beyond words. She nodded slightly, her shoulders relaxing as she took another bite of her lunch. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was peaceful, almost comforting, and Midoriya felt a sense of contentment he hadn't expected. He knew that by sitting with ᴡᴇ, by choosing to befriend her, he was putting himself at risk. He could already imagine the whispers and the judgment from his classmates. But as he watched ᴡᴇ, her small frame hunched over her lunch, he knew he couldn't do anything else. He had seen enough pain and cruelty to last a lifetime, and he wasn't going to let it continue, not if he could help it. And so, as they sat together in the shade of the trees, Midoriya made a silent promise to himself. He would stand by ᴡᴇ, no matter what. Even if it meant standing alone. It didn't take long for Bakugo to confront him. The moment came after school, in the alley behind the gym, where Bakugo had cornered Midoriya, his lackeys standing behind him like shadows. Midoriya had been expecting this, but that didn't make the situation any less daunting. "Oi, Midoriya," Bakugo spat, his voice dripping with contempt. What the hell did you think you were doing? Sticking up for that quirkless loser? Midoriya's heart raced, but he stood his ground, meeting Bakugo's furious gaze with steady eyes. Because bullying is wrong, he said simply, his voice calm despite the storm brewing in front of him. Bakugo's expression twisted into something ugly. Who the hell do you think you are? Looking down on me. You're just as useless as she is, Midoriya. You're nothing. Midoriya didn't flinch. He had heard these words from Bakugo before, but they didn't sting the way they used to. Maybe I am, he replied, his voice unwavering. But that doesn't change the fact that what you're doing is wrong. Bakugo's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, with a snarl, Bakugo lunged at Midoriya, fists clenched and ready to strike. The fight that followed was brutal. Bakugo's lackeys joined in, turning it into a 3-on-1 battle. Midoriya did his best to defend himself, but he was outnumbered, and the hits came fast and hard. He managed to land a few blows of his own, but it was clear that he was struggling to keep up. But Midoriya didn't give up. Even as the punches rained down on him, he refused to back down. He wouldn't let them win, not like this. His determination fueled him, and though he didn't exactly win the fight, he didn't lose either. Eventually, the fight broke off, both sides breathing heavily and nursing their bruises. Bakugo's eyes were still full of rage, but there was something else there too, a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't expected Midoriya to fight back like that, and it threw him off balance. "Tch," Bakugo sneered, wiping blood from his lip. "You're not worth the effort, Midoriya. You're not even worth my time." With that, he turned and stalked off, his lackeys trailing behind him. But the look in Bakugo's eyes told Midoriya that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Over the next few days, the bullying took on a different form. Bakugo and his lackeys no longer confronted Midoriya directly, but the whispers and the rumors spread like wildfire. Students gave him a wide berth, casting suspicious looks his way as if associating with Aiko had somehow tainted him. Midoriya didn't care. He continued to help out Aiko, inviting her to sit with him during lunch and walk with her between classes. He knew the risks, knew that he was isolating himself even further from his classmates, but it didn't matter. Protecting Aiko was worth it. Aiko, for her part, seemed to grow more comfortable around Midoriya. She still didn't say much, but her smiles came more easily, and she no longer flinched when he reached out to help her. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and Midoriya was content with that. And so, a new routine began to take shape, one where Midoriya wasn't quite as alone as he used to be. It wasn't the normal he had known before, but it was a new normal he could live with. For now, that was enough. The dynamics of the school had shifted, with Midoriya now being friends with Aiko. People now avoided Midoriya as well as Aiko, but the underlying currents of bullying remained the same. Aiko had been determined to change her circumstances. Over the summer, she had taken up martial arts training, driven by a desire to stand up for herself. It wasn't easy, but she had managed to gain some confidence and skill, enough to handle most of the bullies who targeted her. However, Bakugo's lackeys were still a formidable challenge. Their numbers and aggression often overwhelmed her, but Midoriya remained vigilant. Whenever he saw Aiko in trouble, he was there to help. His presence was a constant reassurance to her, and it only strengthened their bond. One crisp autumn afternoon, Midoriya was walking home with Aiko, who had grown more talkative with Midoriya after school. They had just finished a grueling day of classes, and Aiko had been subjected to another round of harassment from Bakugo's lackeys. Though she had handled them with newfound skill, the encounter had left her shaken. Midoriya noticed her troubled expression as they walked side by side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Aiko gave a small, tired smile. "I'm okay. I'm getting better at handling them, but sometimes it's still hard." Midoriya nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "You're really strong, Aiko. I've seen how much you've improved." They continued their walk in silence, the golden afternoon light casting long shadows on the pavement. Midoriya had always worn the same insulated jacket, a gift from Midnight, which he found comforting and warm. Aiko had noticed how much he treasured it, often commenting on how it seemed to be a part of him. As they neared their usual spot, a quiet park they often visited, Iko stopped and turned to Midoriya, her expression serious. "Midoriya, there's something I want to give you." He looked at her in curiosity. "What is it?" Iko reached into her backpack and pulled out a neatly folded jacket. It wasn't particularly flashy, but it was well made and had a cozy, soft feel to it. The color was a deep navy blue, and it had a subtle pattern woven into the fabric. Midoriya's eyes widened in surprise. "What's this?" Iko took a deep breath. "I know how cold your quirk makes you. Yours was starting to look worn out, so I wanted to give you this one. It's not as special as the one you have, but I hope it can be something that brings you comfort too." Midoriya was taken aback. The gesture was deeply touching. He reached out and took the jacket from Iko's hands, his fingers brushing against the soft material. "Iko, you didn't have to do this." Iko shook her head, her eyes earnest. "I wanted to. You've been there for me through so much, and I wanted to give you something in return. I hope you'll wear it and think of it as a reminder that you're not alone." Midoriya's heart swelled with emotion. He could feel the warmth of the jacket, but it was the thought behind the gift that made it special. "Thank you, Iko. This means a lot to me." Iko smiled, her cheeks slightly flushed. "I'm glad. And don't worry about the bullies. I'll handle them. Just focus on staying safe." Midoriya nodded, a renewed sense of determination in his eyes. "I will. And I'll be here for you, always." They embraced briefly, the gesture filled with warmth and mutual respect. Midoriya slipped the new jacket on, feeling its comforting embrace. It was a perfect fit, and he knew it would become a cherished part of his wardrobe. As they continued their walk to the park, the sky began to darken, and the first stars of the evening began to appear. The park was serene, and as they settled on their favorite spot under the trees, the tranquility of the moment settled over them. They talked about their dreams, their plans for the future, and the challenges they faced. But amidst the conversation, there was an unspoken understanding that they were each other's anchor. The jacket was more than just a piece of clothing, it was a symbol of their friendship, their shared struggles, and their unwavering support for one another. The world outside might have been harsh and unforgiving, but within their small circle of trust, they had found something precious, a bond that could weather any storm. 7th grade had brought with it a mix of progress and setbacks. Iko had grown stronger, more resilient, and more capable of defending herself against those who sought to harm her. But as her skills improved, so too did the cunning of her tormentors. The bullies had started waiting for the moments when Midoriya wasn't around, moments when Iko was vulnerable and alone. It was as if they had recognized her growing strength and adapted their tactics to exploit her weakest moments. Despite her martial arts training, Iko found herself overwhelmed by the sheer number of attacks and the persistence of her bullies. One particularly harsh afternoon, the school day had ended, and Midoriya had left Iko's side to run a quick errand. As soon as he was out of sight, Bakugo's lackeys seized the opportunity. They cornered Iko near the back of the school, where the shadows were long, and the staff rarely patrolled. "Think you're tough, huh?" one of them sneered, shoving Iko against the cold brick wall. Iko glared back, her fists clenched. "Back off." But her defiance only fueled their aggression. They closed in, fists raised, and Iko had no choice but to defend herself. She managed to fend off a few of the blows, her training evident in the way she moved. But it wasn't enough. They were too many, too ruthless. Aiko's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to fight back. She kicked and punched, but every time she landed a hit, another bully would take the place of the one she'd knocked down. The barrage was relentless, and soon she was on the ground, her strength fading. Just as the situation seemed dire, Midoriya appeared, having returned earlier than expected. The sight of Iko being attacked sent a surge of cold fury through him. Without a word, he unleashed his quirk, dropping the temperature around them drastically. Frost formed on the ground, and the bullies recoiled, their breath visible in the frigid air. "Get away from her!" Midoriya's voice was icy, and his green eyes were alight with anger. The bullies hesitated, glancing at each other nervously before deciding that facing Midoriya wasn't worth the risk. They fled, leaving Iko shivering on the ground. Midoriya rushed to her side, his expression softening as he knelt beside her. "Aiko, are you okay?" Aiko nodded weakly, but tears brimmed in her eyes. I thought I could handle it, but they just kept coming." Midoriya's heart ached for her. He gently helped her to her feet, his hand resting on her shoulder as he steadied her. "You're strong, Aiko. Don't ever doubt that. But you don't have to fight alone. I'll always be here for you." Aiko wiped her eyes and looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's getting worse, Midoriya. They know when you're not around. They wait for you to leave." Midoriya's jaw tightened. He hated that he couldn't always be there to protect her, but he wasn't going to let this continue. "We'll figure something out," he promised. "We'll talk to someone, get the teachers involved, find a way to stop them for good." Aiko shook her head. "The teachers won't help, they never do. They just look the other way." Midoriya's frustration mounted, but he knew she was right. The system that was supposed to protect them was failing. "Then we'll keep fighting together," he said firmly. "I'll stay with you as much as I can. And when I'm not there, just remember that you're not alone. You've got me, and you've got your own strength too." Aiko looked into his eyes and found a glimmer of hope. Despite the fear, despite the pain, she knew she wasn't alone in this. "Thank you, Midoriya. I don't know what I'd do without you." Midoriya smiled gently. "You'll never have to find out." As they walked home together, Aiko leaned on Midoriya for support, her mind racing with thoughts of how to survive another day. But with Midoriya by her side, she knew she had a fighting chance. Days later. As the school year progressed, Aiko's life became an increasingly harsh battle, not just against the bullies, but against the very people who were supposed to protect her. Teachers, who should have been allies, started to contribute to her struggles in subtle, insidious ways. It began with small things: ignored raised hands in class, passing over her during discussions, and harsher grading than her peers. But soon, the teacher's bias against Aiko, a quirkless student, became more overt. It was clear that some of them harbored the same prejudices as the society around them, believing that quirkless people were lesser, destined for failure. One rainy morning, Aiko walked into class, already dreading the day ahead. Mrs. Takahashi, their homeroom teacher, had a reputation for being strict but fair except when it came to Aiko. The students took their seats, and Mrs. Takahashi began handing back their latest test results. "Aiko Tanaka," she called out, her voice cold and disapproving. Aiko stood up and walked to the front of the class to collect her paper. As Mrs. Takahashi handed it to her, she didn't bother to lower her voice. "You barely passed this time. I would suggest you start thinking about more suitable career paths, ones that don't require much intellectual effort." The words stung like a slap. Aiko's cheeks flushed with humiliation as she quickly returned to her seat, trying to disappear into her chair. The other students snickered under their breath, the teacher's words fueling their disdain for her. Midoriya's hands clenched into fists as he watched the exchange, anger bubbling inside him. He wanted to speak up, to defend Aiko, but he knew it would only make things worse for her. Instead, he shot her a look of sympathy and support, silently promising to stand by her side no matter what. But Mrs. Takahashi's cruelty didn't end there. She continued to single Aiko out in class, using every opportunity to undermine her confidence. If Aiko answered a question correctly, Mrs. Takahashi would find a way to twist her words, making her seem wrong. If she asked for help, Mrs. Takahashi would dismiss her with a condescending remark, implying that Aiko was too slow to keep up. Outside the classroom, the bullying from students continued to escalate. Emboldened by the teachers' attitudes, the bullies grew bolder, knowing they could get away with their cruelty. They taunted Aiko relentlessly, mocking her for being quirkless, for being stupid in the eyes of the teachers. One particularly harsh day, after enduring a barrage of insults from both the bullies and Mrs. Takahashi, Aiko found herself in the school bathroom, tears streaming down her face. She clutched the sink, trying to steady her breathing, but the weight of it all was suffocating. Midoriya found her there, having noticed her absence from the usual after-school walk home. When he saw her hunched over the sink, he felt a pang of guilt for not being able to protect her from all of this. He approached her slowly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Aiko," he said softly, "you don't have to go through this alone." Aiko looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy. "It's not just the bullies, Midoriya. It's the teachers, too. They hate me, they think I'm worthless because I don't have a quirk." Midoriya's heart broke for her. He knew all too well how cruel people could be, but seeing Aiko suffer like this was unbearable. "They're wrong, Aiko. You're not worthless. You're one of the strongest people I know, and it doesn't matter what they think. You're going to prove them all wrong." Aiko sniffled, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "But what if I can't? What if they're right?" "They're not," Midoriya said firmly. "You're strong, smart, and you have a heart that's bigger than any of theirs. We'll get through this together. And one day, they'll see how wrong they were." Aiko looked at him, the weight of his words giving her the strength she needed to keep going. "Thank you, Midoriya. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to do anything without me," Midoriya replied with a small smile. "We're a team, remember?" As they walked home together, the rain drizzling down, Aiko felt a small spark of hope reignite within her. The world might be against her, but with Midoriya by her side, she knew she could face whatever came her way. The day had been emotionally draining for both Midoriya and Aiko. The bullying had taken a darker turn recently, not just from their classmates but from some of the teachers as well. Subtle comments, condescending tones, and the occasional pointed remark about Aiko's quirkless status had made her school life even more unbearable. Midoriya had noticed the shift, but the teachers were careful to avoid saying anything directly in front of him, making it difficult for him to intervene. That afternoon, as they walked home together, when they reached Aiko's home, her parents are home like normal. After calling her parents, she finds out they had to stay late at work. Midoriya could see the weariness in Aiko's eyes. He tried to lighten the mood, but Aiko's smile was faint, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Midoriya thinks for a bit, he pauses, sensing that she needs something to lift her spirits. "Hey, Aiko," Midoriya began, trying to sound upbeat, "would you like to come over for dinner? My mom would be thrilled to meet you." Aiko looked at him, surprised. "Dinner? Are you sure it's okay?" "Absolutely. My mom's really kind, and she loves meeting my friends," Midoriya replied with a reassuring smile. Aiko hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'd like that." As they approached Midoriya's home, Aiko couldn't help but feel a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. She had never been to a friend's house before, she had never really had any friends to visit. But Midoriya had been a constant source of support, and she trusted him. The moment they walked through the door, Midoriya was there to greet them. Her eyes immediately filled with tears when she saw Aiko standing next to her son. "Oh my goodness, Izuku! You've brought a friend home!" Inko exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. She quickly wiped her tears and beamed at Aiko. "Welcome! You must be Aiko. Izuku has mentioned you before. It's so wonderful to finally meet you." Aiko smiled shyly, a little overwhelmed by the warm reception. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Midoriya. Oh, please, call me Inko." "Any friend of Izuku's is always welcome here," Inko said, her eyes glistening with happy tears. She turned to her son, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Izuku, for making new friends." Midoriya blushed, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. He wasn't sure how to correct his mother's misunderstanding about his friendship with Bakugo, and now, with Aiko standing there, it seemed impossible to untangle the web of half-truths. As they settled into the living room, Inko continued to chatter happily, asking Aiko about school, her interests, and how she and Midoriya had become friends. Aiko answered politely, though she carefully avoided mentioning the bullying or the harsh treatment she'd endured. Just as they were getting comfortable, the doorbell rang. "Oh. That must be the Bakugos," Inko said, hurrying to the door. Midoriya's heart sank. He had been completely uninformed that the Bakugos family was coming over for dinner. He exchanged a nervous glance with Aiko, who looked equally unsettled. Before either of them could react, the door opened, and the familiar voices of Mitsuki and Masaru Bakugo filled the entryway, followed by the unmistakable sound of Katsuki's footsteps. Midoriya, ᴚᴇ. Mitsuki's voice was loud and cheerful as she entered the living room, followed by her husband and their son. It's so nice to see you both. Katsuki walked in last, his expression neutral but his eyes flickering with something unreadable as he spotted ᴚᴇ sitting next to Midoriya. For a split second, there was a tense silence, but then Katsuki's face broke into a forced smile. Hey, Midoriya, ᴚᴇ, Katsuki said casually, his tone so convincingly friendly that it made Aiko's stomach churn. Didn't know you came over here, ᴚᴇ. Glad to see you. Aiko forced a smile, playing along, though she could feel the tension radiating from Katsuki. Yeah, Midoriya invited me. It's nice to see you too, Bakugo. Dinner was a strained affair, at least for Midoriya and Aiko. Inko and Mitsuki were chatting away happily, oblivious to the underlying tension at the table. Masaru, as usual, was quiet, content to let his wife do most of the talking. Katsuki, however, was playing his role almost too well, engaging in light conversation with both Midoriya and Aiko, his demeanor perfectly masking the hostility that simmered just beneath the surface. Inko, oblivious to the tension, sent the kids to Midoriya's room while the adults goofed off. The evening sunlight filtered through the curtains of Midoriya's room, casting a warm glow over the simple space. The room was tidy, with a few books neatly stacked on a shelf, a desk where Midoriya did his homework, and a small bed in the corner. It was a typical teenager's room, unremarkable but comfortable. Aiko, Bakugo, and Midoriya sat in the room silently, where the tension between the three had been palpable. Bakugo played his part well, as he always did, but there was an underlying edge to his behavior, a quiet hostility that only Midoriya and Aiko could detect. Now, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the trio was surrounded by a mix of awkward silence and forced conversation. Aiko, usually quiet, seemed even more withdrawn, her eyes occasionally flicking to Bakugo with a mix of wariness and something else, perhaps a hint of fear. Bakugo, on the other hand, was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Midoriya sat opposite them, trying to ease the tension with light-hearted chatter, but the atmosphere remained strained. Midoriya could hardly focus on his food, his mind racing with how to navigate the situation without raising suspicion. He couldn't bring himself to shatter his mother's belief that he and Katsuki were still friends, especially not in front of Aiko. He could see the confusion and discomfort in Aiko's eyes, and he silently cursed himself for putting her in this position. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted to school and future aspirations. Katsuki was his usual confident self, boasting about how he was going to be the greatest hero someday. Inko beamed with pride at her son's friend, while Midoriya and Aiko exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, dinner came to an end. Inko insisted on sending Aiko home with a small box of leftovers, much to Aiko's polite protest. As they all stood in the entryway, preparing to say their goodbyes, Katsuki gave Midoriya a hard look, his eyes narrowing slightly. See you at school, Midoriya, Katsuki said, his voice low enough that only Midoriya could hear the underlying threat. Then, louder, he added, you too, Aiko. Take care. Aiko nodded, her smile tight as she glanced at Midoriya. Yeah, see you. As the Bakugo family left, the door closing behind them, Inko turned to Midoriya and Aiko with a bright smile. That was such a lovely dinner, wasn't it? I'm so glad you could join us, Aiko. Aiko nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. Thank you for having me, Inko. It was really nice. Midoriya watched her carefully, sensing her discomfort. I'll walk you home, Aiko, he offered. Aiko smiled gratefully. Thank you, Midoriya. As they walked in the cool night air, neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Aiko broke the silence. Your mom is really nice. She's really proud of you. Midoriya sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, she is. But I don't know how to tell her the truth about Bakugo. She's so happy thinking we're still friends. I didn't want to ruin that for her. Aiko nodded in understanding. I get it. It's hard when the people we care about have the wrong idea, but we don't want to hurt them. They walked in silence again, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, as they reached Aiko's house, she turned to him, her expression serious. Midoriya. I know it's hard, but you don't have to carry this alone. You've been there for me, and I want to be there for you too. Midoriya looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Aiko. That means a lot. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. We'll get through this, together. As she disappeared inside her house, Midoriya stood on the doorstep for a moment, taking in her words. He felt a renewed sense of determination, a resolve to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't alone, he had Aiko, and that made all the difference. The next day, after the somewhat strained dinner with the Bakugos, Midoriya and Aiko found themselves walking to school together once more. The cool morning air was refreshing, and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of the early sun. Despite the challenges they faced, the familiar routine of their morning walk was a comfort. So, Aiko began, breaking the silence with a teasing tone, "How do you manage to stay so calm around Bakugo? I saw you trying to keep a straight face when he was boasting about his future as the greatest hero." Midoriya chuckled, his face brightening at her playful jab. "Honestly, it's a skill I've honed over the years." "You get used to his enthusiasm." Aiko smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Enthusiasm? Is that what we're calling it now?" "I thought it was more of a loud and intense motivation kind of thing." Midoriya laughed, shaking his head. "You're not wrong. But he does have a way of making everything sound like it's the most important thing in the world. It's kind of impressive, in a way." Aiko's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well, I'd say it's impressive how you manage to keep your cool. I mean, I saw you suppressing a laugh when he was talking about his training routine." "Yeah, his secret training always seems to involve a lot of yelling and explosive demonstrations," Midoriya said, grinning. "I'm just glad he's not using it on us." Aiko nodded, her expression thoughtful. "True. But it's also nice to see that despite his intensity, he's still your friend. Even if it's complicated." Midoriya's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with a more cheerful expression. "Yeah, it's complicated, but he's been a part of my life for a long time. It's hard to just change that, you know?" Aiko's gaze softened. "I get it. It's like trying to untangle a knot you've been working on for years. It's messy and confusing, but it's part of the process." Midoriya nodded appreciatively. "Exactly. And having you around makes it a lot easier. You always know how to put things into perspective." Aiko grinned, playfully nudging him with her elbow. "Well, someone has to keep you grounded. Otherwise, you'd probably spend all your time talking about your secret hero plans and tripping over your own 괅ᴜᴜ." Midoriya laughed, shaking his head. "I suppose you're right. I do tend to get a bit carried away with things. But that's why I'm glad you're here, to keep me from going overboard." Aiko tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "And what about me? Do I get any perks for being your personal reality check?" Midoriya pretended to think it over, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, you get my eternal gratitude and a front row seat to all my heroic escapades. Not to mention, I'll make sure you're never short of snacks when you need them." Aiko laughed, her spirits clearly lifted by their banter. "Sounds like a deal. But don't think I'm going to let you off easy. If you ever get too caught up in your heroic schemes, I'll be there to pull you back down to earth." Midoriya chuckled, his heart feeling lighter. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they continued their walk to school, their conversation flowed easily, filled with light-hearted jokes and genuine laughter. Despite the weight of their challenges, these moments of banter and camaraderie provided a much-needed reprieve. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of difficulty, there were still small joys to be found in friendship and shared moments. By the time they reached the school gates, both of them felt a bit more buoyant, ready to face whatever the day had in store. The trials they faced were still there, but they had each other to lean on, and that made all the difference. The library had always been a refuge for Midoriya and Aiko, a place where they could escape the pressures of school and find solace in their shared love for reading. Today, as Midoriya walked towards the library, his thoughts were focused on the book he had promised Aiko he would bring. The crisp autumn air and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot were soothing, but as he neared the library entrance, a sense of unease settled over him. Through the large windows, he saw Aiko surrounded by a group of middle schoolers. His heart sank as he recognized a few of the faces. These were the same bullies who had made her life miserable before. They were shouting at her, their voices harsh and taunting. Aiko's usually bright face was marred by a look of fear and determination. Midoriya didn't hesitate. His quirk reacted almost instinctively. As he approached, he saw one of the bullies stepping forward aggressively. Midoriya's hands grew cold, and with a determined stride, he touched the shoulder of one of the bullies who was trying to assault Aiko. The boy screamed as the frostbite took hold, his skin turning an unnatural, pale white. The other bullies recoiled in shock and fear, their bravado melting away in the face of Midoriya's chilling presence. The boy with frostbite fell to the ground, clutching his arm and gasping in pain. The group quickly dispersed, their harsh laughter and jeers replaced by hurried footsteps and worried glances. Midoriya's eyes were cold and unyielding as he watched them leave. He turned to Aiko, who was trembling but unharmed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Aiko looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I'm fine, Midoriya. Thanks to you." Before Midoriya could respond, a teacher arrived, having heard the commotion. The teacher's expression was stern as they approached Midoriya. "Midoriya, come with me. We need to discuss this incident." Midoriya, sensing the gravity of the situation, followed the teacher to the principal's office, his heart heavy with the knowledge that things were about to get complicated. Aiko trailed behind, her face a mixture of worry and relief. The principal's office was austere, filled with wooden furniture and a large desk that seemed to dominate the room. The principal, a stern-looking man with graying hair, looked up as Midoriya and the teacher entered. His gaze shifted to Aiko, then back to Midoriya. "Mr. Midoriya, do you understand why you're here?" the principal asked, his tone businesslike. "I used my quirk to stop someone from hurting Aiko," Midoriya replied, his voice calm and resolute. "They were bullying her, and I couldn't just stand by." The principal's eyes narrowed. "Your actions were severe. You've inflicted frostbite on one of the students. This is a serious violation of school policy." Midoriya remained steadfast. "I don't regret stopping them. They've been tormenting Aiko for too long." Before the situation could escalate further, the door to the office swung open, and Inko Midoriya entered. Her eyes were red, her face a mix of worry and anger. She had been summoned by the school, and the sight of her son in trouble had clearly taken an emotional toll. Inko's lawyer instincts took over as she faced the principal. "I demand an explanation for why my son is being treated like a criminal. I expect a full account of this incident." The principal seemed taken aback by Inko's forceful presence. "Ms. Midoriya, your son's actions have resulted in injury. We need to address this matter according to our policies." Inko's eyes were steely as she replied, "I understand the situation. However, if this matter is not resolved fairly, we will pursue legal action. I am prepared to escalate this to the appropriate authorities." The principal shifted uneasily, realizing the implications of Inko's threat. "We'll review the incident and take your concerns into consideration." With a nod, Inko turned to Midoriya, her expression softening slightly. "We're going home. We'll discuss this further when we're away from this place." Midoriya, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, didn't show any signs of remorse. His expression remained resolute, focused solely on ensuring Aiko's safety. He didn't regret his actions. In his mind, they were a necessary response to the continued bullying. As they left the principal's office, Inko's phone rang, and she stepped outside to take the call. Midoriya and Aiko were left alone in the hallway, the tension of the day's events hanging heavily in the air. Aiko looked up at Midoriya, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. "You didn't have to use your quirk like that, but I'm really grateful you did." Midoriya met her gaze, his voice softening. "I couldn't just let them hurt you. It's not right." Aiko nodded, a small smile appearing on her face despite the circumstances. "I know. And I appreciate it more than you know." As they walked home together, the sky was darkening, and the first stars began to appear. The weight of the day's events was heavy, but in their shared silence, there was a sense of understanding and solidarity. Despite the world's harshness and the ongoing challenges they faced, Midoriya and ᴡᴇ found strength in each other's presence. The struggles and injustices they encountered were significant, but their bond was a source of resilience and hope. Together, they faced a world that often seemed unforgiving, knowing that their friendship and support for one another were powerful enough to navigate even the most difficult of circumstances. It was a rare weekend where neither Midoriya nor ᴡᴇ had pressing schoolwork or extracurricular activities. The sun filtered through the blinds of Midoriya's room, casting soft shadows on the floor. The room was cozy, with a few posters of heroes on the walls, though nothing too extravagant. Books were scattered on the desk, and a small stack of manga sat beside the bed, a testament to Midoriya's love for stories, both fictional and real. ᴡᴇ was sprawled out on the floor, her head resting on a pillow she had swiped from Midoriya's bed. She was flipping through one of the manga volumes, her eyes scanning the pages with mild interest. Midoriya sat cross-legged on the bed, fiddling with a small gadget he had found at a second-hand store earlier that week. "So," ᴡᴇ began, not looking up from the manga, "are you actually going to read this thing, or did you just buy it because it looked cool?" Midoriya chuckled, glancing over at her. "Hey, I bought it because it looked cool and because I'm planning to fix it up. It's a win-win." ᴡᴇ rolled her eyes, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're such a nerd, you know that?" Says the girl who can recite every line from **ᴡᴇʟᴜᴜ** by heart. Midoriya shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Touché," ᴡᴇ admitted, finally looking up from the manga to meet his gaze. "But at least my obsession is with something literary. You just like tinkering with old junk." "It's not junk," Midoriya protested, holding up the gadget defensively. "This could be something really useful if I can get it to work again." ᴡᴇ snorted softly. Sure. And what exactly is it supposed to do?" Midoriya paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the gadget. "Well, I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think it's some sort of old communication device. Maybe I can use it to send messages or signals. I just need to figure out how it works." ᴡᴇ hummed in thought, her teasing tone softening. "You know, you could probably build something like that from scratch. You're smart enough." Midoriya felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "Thanks, ᴡᴇ. That means a lot coming from you." She smiled at him, and for a moment, the room was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind that only close friends can share. After a while, ᴡᴇ set the manga aside and stretched her arms above her head. "So, what's the plan for today? Are we just going to sit around and be boring, or do you actually have something fun in mind?" Midoriya grinned, setting the gadget down on his bed. "Well, I was thinking we could go check out that new cafe that opened up near the station. I heard they have really good hot chocolate." ᴡᴇ's eyes lit up at the mention of hot chocolate. "Now you're talking. But first, you're going to show me how that communication device of yours is supposed to work." Midoriya laughed, knowing full well that she was just humoring him. All right. But don't say I didn't warn you if it explodes or something." "Please," ᴡᴇ scoffed, "if anyone's going to make something explode, it's going to be you, not me." They both laughed, the sound echoing through the small room. It was moments like these that made all the stress and pressure of their daily lives fade away, if only for a little while. In those fleeting moments, it was just Midoriya and ᴡᴇ, two friends enjoying each other's company without a care in the world. It was just Midoriya and ᴡᴇ, two friends enjoying each other's company without a care in the world. The atmosphere in Midoriya's room was warm and relaxed, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of school life they both faced. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft golden light across the room. The two of them sat on the floor, a half-finished board game between them, and snacks spread out on a small table nearby. ᴡᴇ reached for a piece of candy, her eyes narrowing playfully at Midoriya. "You know, you're really bad at this game," she teased, popping the candy into her mouth. Midoriya grinned, not the least bit offended. "Says the one who lost 3 times in a row last time." "Those were flukes," ᴡᴇ shot back, trying to sound indignant but failing as a smile tugged at her lips. Flukes? You say that every time, Midoriya laughed, shaking his head. He moved his piece on the board, making a strategic play that put him in the lead. Looks like I'm winning this time. Aiko rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh please, don't get too cocky. The game's not over yet. She leaned over the board, contemplating her next move with exaggerated seriousness. I could still turn this around, you know. Midoriya watched her with a fond smile. It was moments like these that he cherished the most. No pressure, no bullies, no worries, just Aiko and him, sharing a simple, light-hearted moment. It reminded him that despite everything they went through, they still had each other. Aiko finally made her move, and it was a good one, but not enough to put her ahead. She huffed in mock frustration, crossing her arms. Okay, maybe you're not that bad at this game. Midoriya chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. They continued to play, their banter flowing easily between them. Aiko would throw in a sarcastic comment, and Midoriya would counter with a joke, both of them laughing at how ridiculous they could be. The game eventually ended with Midoriya as the winner, but Aiko didn't seem to mind. She flopped onto her back, staring up at the ceiling with a contented sigh. You know, this is nice, she said softly. Midoriya lay down beside her, looking up at the ceiling too. Yeah, it is. I wish things could always be like this. Aiko turned her head to look at him, her expression thoughtful. Me too. But at least we have moments like these, right? Midoriya met her gaze and nodded. Yeah, we do. For a while, they just lay there in comfortable silence, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood outside. The world felt distant, almost like it didn't exist beyond the walls of Midoriya's room. In this little bubble of theirs, they could forget about everything else. Eventually, Aiko spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Thanks for being my friend, Midoriya. Midoriya turned to her, surprised by the sudden seriousness in her tone. Of course, Aiko. You're one of my best friends. Aiko smiled, but there was something a little sad in her eyes, something that Midoriya couldn't quite place. Before he could ask her about it, she sat up and stretched, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. So, what do you want to do next? Aiko asked, changing the subject. Midoriya sat up as well, feeling a slight pang of concern but pushing it aside. We could start another game, or maybe watch something? Your pick. Aiko considered it for a moment, then smiled brightly. How about both? We can play while something's on in the background. Midoriya laughed. Multitasking, huh? Alright, let's do it. As they set up for another round, Midoriya couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind Aiko's words, something she wasn't telling him. But he didn't press her. Instead, he just enjoyed the time they had together, savoring the warmth of their friendship, unaware of how much he would come to treasure this memory in the days to come. Midoriya and Aiko had shared a brief moment of normalcy, but the pressures of their looming futures began to weigh heavily on them, particularly Midoriya. With ᴅᴜᴜ's entrance exams approaching, his focus had shifted almost entirely to his studies and training. He spent long hours poring over textbooks, refining his abilities, and making sure he was prepared for the challenges ahead. Every spare moment was dedicated to ensuring his application was perfect. But as Midoriya became more engrossed in his preparations, Aiko found herself increasingly alone. Their usual routine of walking to and from school together had become sporadic. Midoriya was often preoccupied, his mind filled with strategies and techniques. Aiko understood ᴅᴜᴜ was Midoriya's dream, after all, but she couldn't help but feel the growing distance between them. With Midoriya's absence, the bullies took full advantage. They seemed to know exactly when Midoriya would be too busy to notice, and they capitalized on every opportunity. The taunts grew harsher, the physical harassment more frequent. Without Midoriya's protective presence, Aiko was left to fend for herself more often than not. One day, after a particularly brutal encounter, Aiko sat alone in a secluded corner of the schoolyard, nursing a fresh set of bruises. She had tried to defend herself, as she always did, but the numbers were against her. Her sleeves, which had become her constant companion no matter the weather, hid the marks from the world, but she couldn't hide the emotional toll it was taking on her. Midoriya, unaware of the extent of Aiko's suffering, was deeply entrenched in his own worries. He still made time to meet Aiko whenever he could, but their interactions were shorter, more rushed. He would always check in on her, ask how she was doing, but he never seemed to catch the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her usual cheerful responses had turned into quiet, one-word answers. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Midoriya noticed that Aiko had been particularly quiet. "Is everything all right, Aiko?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Aiko forced a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just tired," she replied softly. Midoriya nodded, accepting her answer, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something was off. "You've been working really hard too, huh?" "I guess we both are." "Yeah," Aiko murmured. "We both are." The conversation drifted into silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. As they approached Aiko's house, she turned to him, her expression more serious than usual. "Midoriya," she began hesitantly, "I know you're really busy with your UA stuff, and I don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother, Aiko," Midoriya interrupted, his voice firm. "You're my friend. I'm always here for you." Aiko's smile returned, but it was tinged with sadness. "Thanks. I just wanted to say that I'm really proud of you. You're going to do great things, I know it." Midoriya blushed slightly, scratching the back of his head. "Thanks, Aiko. That means a lot coming from you." Aiko nodded, but instead of her usual "see you later," she simply said, "Goodbye, Midoriya." Midoriya paused, his brow furrowing at the change in her words. "Goodbye? You make it sound so final." Aiko shrugged, a distant look in her eyes. "Just feels right to say it, I guess." He wanted to ask more, to press her on why she seemed so distant, but the weight of his responsibilities pulled at him, urging him to keep moving forward. With a final wave, he turned and headed towards his own home, unaware of the turmoil brewing within Aiko. As he walked away, Aiko watched him go, her heart heavy with a growing sense of despair. She had always been able to rely on Midoriya, but now, as he moved closer to achieving his dreams, she felt herself slipping further into the shadows. And with each passing day, the shadows grew darker, threatening to consume her entirely. Days later. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the schoolyard as Midoriya hurried towards the back of the building. He had been on his way to meet Aiko for lunch when he heard the faint, familiar sounds of a struggle. His heart raced, and his mind filled with dread as he sprinted towards the noise. The closer he got, the more his stomach twisted in fear. By the time Midoriya rounded the corner, the bullies had already scattered, leaving Aiko alone on the cold, hard ground. She was curled up, holding her sides, her long black hair falling in disarray around her face. Her uniform was disheveled, and there were fresh bruises on her arms, visible even through the long sleeves she insisted on wearing, no matter the weather. "Aiko!" Midoriya's voice cracked as he dropped to his knees beside her. He reached out, gently brushing the hair from her face, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and a painful attempt at a smile. "I'm fine, Midoriya," Aiko whispered, though her voice betrayed the pain she was in. "Really, it's nothing." Midoriya's heart ached at the sight of her, and guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't been there in time, again. It felt like no matter how hard he tried to protect her, the bullies always managed to find their moments when he wasn't around. "Aiko, I'm so sorry. I should have been here sooner," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. He hated himself for not being faster, for letting her face this alone. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a protective embrace. "I'm sorry." Aiko leaned into him, her body trembling slightly as she tried to hold back more tears. "You can't always be there, Midoriya," she murmured, her voice heavy with resignation. "It's not your fault. It's just how things are." Midoriya tightened his hold, feeling her pain as if it were his own. "But it shouldn't be like this," he insisted, his voice fierce with determination. "You shouldn't have to go through this, Aiko. You deserve better." She let out a small, bitter laugh, a sound that broke Midoriya's heart even more. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's just how things are." Midoriya held her tighter, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to argue, to tell her that things could change, that they would change. But as he looked down at the bruises on her arms and the sadness in her eyes, he knew that words weren't enough. After a few moments of silence, ᴚᴇ pulled away slightly, wiping her tears with the back of her sleeve. "We should go before someone sees us," she whispered, trying to compose herself. Midoriya nodded, though he didn't want to move. He carefully helped ᴚᴇ to her feet, keeping a steady arm around her to support her as they made their way towards the school side entrance, avoiding the main hallways. As they walked, Midoriya couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that clung to him. He had to do something more, something that would make a difference. He couldn't stand to see ᴚᴇ hurt like this anymore. But for now, all he could do was be there for her, as much as he possibly could. And so, he stayed close to her side, his presence a silent promise that he wouldn't let her face this alone. The start of the final term in 8th grade marked a pivotal moment in both Midoriya and ᴚᴇ's lives. While the pressure of UAHI's entrance exam loomed over Midoriya, ᴚᴇ faced a different kind of challenge, a cruel one that had only intensified over the years. ᴚᴇ's presence at school had become even more isolated. The whispers behind her back, the pointed stares, and the subtle but hurtful actions of her classmates had grown more vicious. They no longer just targeted her quirklessness, they had moved on to crueler, more personal jabs. Some teachers had joined in, making snide remarks about her future prospects or conveniently ignoring her struggles in class. Midoriya tried his best to be there for ᴚᴇ, but as the exam drew nearer, his time became increasingly scarce. The demanding schedule of practice exams, study sessions, and quirk training left him with little room for anything else. He still made sure to meet ᴚᴇ whenever he could, but the time they spent together was a fraction of what it used to be. ᴚᴇ, on the other hand, was sinking further into despair. The bullying at school was relentless, and she had begun to withdraw even more. Her usual quiet resolve was replaced by a somber silence, and her once bright eyes now held a deep sadness. Midoriya noticed the changes but chalked it up to the stress of the exams. One cold winter day, as they walked home from school, ᴚᴇ turned to Midoriya with a small, hesitant smile. "Midoriya," she began, her voice soft, "I have something for you." Midoriya looked at her curiously. "What is it?" ᴚᴇ reached into her bag and pulled out an oversized jacket. It was a deep shade of navy blue, thick enough to block out the autumn winds but not so heavy as to be burdensome. The fabric was soft to the touch, with a simple yet elegant design. The jacket was clearly too big for Midoriya at his current size. "This is for you," ᴚᴇ said, holding out the jacket. "I know you're always cold, and I thought this might help." Midoriya took the jacket, his eyes wide with surprise. "ᴚᴇ, this is... It's too much. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," ᴚᴇ interrupted, her voice firmer than before. "You've always been there for me, and I wanted to give you something that could help you in return. I know you'll grow into it. It's not much, but I hope it keeps you warm." Midoriya smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, ᴚᴇ. I'll treasure it." ᴚᴇ smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm glad." As they continued walking, ᴚᴇ was quieter than usual, her thoughts seemingly far away. When they reached the point where they usually parted ways, ᴚᴇ paused, turning to Midoriya. Normally, she would say "see you later," but this time, she hesitated. "Goodbye, Midoriya," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Midoriya blinked in surprise at her choice of words. "Goodbye? ᴚᴇ, we'll see each other tomorrow, right?" ᴚᴇ nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah. Goodbye." As she walked away, Midoriya watched her go, a small knot of unease forming in his stomach. Something about the way she had said goodbye felt final. But before he could dwell on it further, the weight of his own responsibilities pulled his thoughts back to the present. The following day, as Midoriya was out of school sick, ᴚᴇ faced another day of torment at school. But this time, something inside her had finally broken. The whispers, the sneers, the blatant disregard for her well-being, it all weighed on her, crushing her spirit under its relentless pressure. She walked through the halls, her eyes downcast, her steps slow and heavy. She felt invisible, like a ghost drifting through the world without purpose. The oversized jacket she had given Midoriya was the last piece of herself she had left to give, and now, even that was gone. As the school day dragged on, Aiko found herself slipping further into the darkness that had taken root in her mind. She couldn't see a way out, no light at the end of the tunnel, no hope for a better tomorrow. And so, as the final bell rang and the other students flooded out of the building, Aiko lingered behind, her heart heavy with despair. She knew she had one final goodbye to say, but this time, it wouldn't be to Midoriya. Instead, she turned to the empty classroom, the empty halls, and whispered a soft, tearful farewell to the life she no longer felt she belonged to. Midoriya, too wrapped up in his preparations, didn't notice that Aiko hadn't come to meet him after school as usual. He was too focused on his future to realize that Aiko's had already slipped away. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Midoriya was accepted to take the entrance exam for UA, and the excitement of his achievement was shared by his mother and even by Aiko when he told her the news. But in the midst of his success, Aiko's situation grew increasingly dire. The bullying escalated, becoming more vicious with each passing day. Her classmates' taunts were crueler, their actions more harmful. The teachers continued to turn a blind eye, some even subtly encouraging the mistreatment. Aiko's previously vibrant spirit was all but extinguished, replaced by a hollow shell of the girl Midoriya had known. Despite the distance that had grown between them, Aiko still put on a brave face whenever she was with Midoriya. She didn't want to burden him with her troubles, especially now that he was so close to achieving his dream. But the signs were there, if only he had noticed the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way she wore long sleeves no matter the weather, and the way she increasingly avoided looking him in the eyes. One afternoon, as they sat together in a quiet corner of the school courtyard, Midoriya tried to engage Aiko in conversation, hoping to lighten her mood. "You know, Aiko, once I start at UA, I'll have access to all sorts of cool training facilities," Midoriya said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Maybe I can sneak you in sometime, and we can train together. It'll be like old times." Aiko gave him a small, sad smile. "That sounds nice, Midoriya. But you'll be really busy. You won't have time to worry about someone like me." Midoriya frowned, not liking the way she had phrased that. "Aiko, you're my friend. I'll always have time for you." Aiko looked down at her hands, fiddling with the sleeves of her jacket. "I know, but things change. People change. You're going to be a hero, Midoriya. And I'm just me." Midoriya opened his mouth to protest, but Aiko stood up, cutting him off. "I should go. It's getting late." Midoriya stood as well, worry etched on his face. "Are you sure you're okay? You seemed different lately." Aiko forced another smile, this one even more strained than before. "I'm fine, really. Just tired." Before he could say anything more, Aiko leaned in and gave him a quick hug. "Goodbye, Midoriya," she whispered, before turning and walking away. Midoriya watched her go, that same knot of unease tightening in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to ask her what was really going on, but the words caught in his throat. As much as he cared for Aiko, his mind was too clouded with his own concerns to fully grasp the depth of her pain. And so, he let her go, unaware that this goodbye would be one of their last. It was well past midnight when Midoriya's phone rang, the blaring sound jolting him from his restless sleep. He fumbled for the device, his groggy mind struggling to make sense of the situation. The screen lit up with Aiko's name. A wave of concern washed over him as he answered the call. "Aiko," he asked, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. "Is everything okay?" Her voice, shaky and distant, came through the speaker. "Midoriya. I'm sorry to call you so late. I need to say goodbye." The words felt like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? Aiko, what's going on?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of Aiko's shallow breathing. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. You've been so kind to me. I'm really grateful for all the time we've spent together. I'm sorry for being such a burden." Midoriya's heart raced, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. "Aiko, don't say that. You're not a burden. Please, talk to me. Tell me what's happening." She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can keep going. I needed you to know that you've made a difference. I don't think I'd have made it this far without you." The implications were clear, even if she didn't say it outright. Panic surged through Midoriya. "Aiko, don't do anything. I'm coming over. Just stay where you are. I'm on my way." He hung up the phone and scrambled out of bed, his mind racing. Despite the late hour, he threw on his clothes and rushed out the door. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by a frantic urgency as he sprinted toward Aiko's house. The streets were quiet, the only sound the pounding of his heart in his ears. His thoughts were a whirlwind of worry and fear. He couldn't afford to waste any time. Aiko's words replayed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of the gravity of the situation. As he neared Aiko's house, he noticed the dim light of her bedroom window. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the front door, only to find it locked. He pounded on the door, shouting her name, but there was no response. Midoriya's heart sank. He knew her parents were out working late, which meant she was home alone. Without hesitation, he used his quirk, a burst of frost forming around his hands as he delivered a powerful strike to the door. It splintered under the force, and he pushed through, his urgency propelling him forward. The inside of the house was eerily quiet. Midoriya's breath fogged in the cold air as he hurried through the hallway, calling out for Aiko. He reached her bedroom door and pushed it open, his eyes scanning the room frantically. What he saw froze him in place. Aiko's body hung lifelessly from a noose, the rope taut and the room illuminated by the dim light of a bedside lamp. Midoriya's eyes were drawn to the note lying on the floor beneath her, the words barely visible in the low light. He staggered forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the note. Tears blurred his vision as he read the heartfelt message. The words were a final expression of gratitude, a bittersweet acknowledgement of their time together. In his desperation, Midoriya reached out and carefully lowered Aiko's body, his heart breaking with each passing second. He held her gently, tears streaming down his face as he whispered apologies and reassurances he wished he could have said sooner. The reality of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. He had been so absorbed in his own struggles and the demands of his UA applications that he hadn't seen the signs, hadn't noticed the deepening sadness in Aiko's eyes. He could barely comprehend the weight of his failure. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Midoriya remained at Aiko's side, the enormity of the night's events settling heavily on him. The house was soon filled with the sound of sirens and the arrival of emergency responders, but the damage had already been done. In the days that followed, Midoriya grappled with the crushing weight of grief and guilt. He was haunted by what-ifs and regrets, unable to escape the shadow of that fateful night. The memory of Aiko's final call, her gratitude, and her unspoken pain lingered, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of truly seeing the people we care about. Midoriya's resolve to honor Aiko's memory became a driving force in his life. He poured himself into his studies and his preparation for UA, determined to make a difference and to prevent others from experiencing the same pain that had befallen his dear friend. The chapter of Aiko's life had closed, but the impact she left on Midoriya was profound and lasting. Her memory would forever be a part of him, a guiding light in his journey to become a hero and to make the world a better place for those who needed it most. The funeral came on a cold, gray day, the sky a heavy blanket of clouds that seemed to mirror the grief that hung in the air. The somber event was a stark contrast to the vibrant autumn colors that had marked the season, as if the world itself was mourning Aiko's loss. Midoriya stood with his mother, his heart weighed down by a profound sense of foreboding. The news of Aiko's passing had hit him like a freight train, leaving him numb, unable to fully grasp the reality of her absence. In the days leading up to the funeral, Midoriya had moved through life in a daze. The familiar routine of school, training, and studying for UA felt meaningless, overshadowed by a gnawing emptiness. Aiko's coat, which she had given him just months before, now felt like a cruel reminder of her absence. Its warmth was a bittersweet comfort, a physical connection to a friend who was no longer there. The room where Aiko's family had gathered was quiet and dimly lit, filled with the soft murmurings of those who came to pay their respects. The occasional stifled sob echoed in the space, a heartbreaking reminder of the collective grief shared by everyone present. Midoriya, standing among the mourners, struggled to hold back his own tears. He felt like an intruder in this sea of sorrow, unsure of how to process the overwhelming sadness that threatened to consume him. As he approached Aiko's parents, his steps felt heavy, each one burdened by the weight of regret. Aiko's mother, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying, looked up at him. The sight of her, so broken and grief-stricken, nearly shattered Midoriya's fragile composure. She reached out to him, her hands trembling as she grasped his. "I'm so sorry, Midoriya," she said, her voice choked with sorrow. "Aiko talked so much about you. I'm glad she had a friend like you." The words pierced through Midoriya, bringing with them a wave of guilt that he could barely stand. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. I'm sorry for your loss. She was a wonderful friend. I should have noticed. I should have been there more." Aiko's mother shook her head, her grip on his hands tightening. "You were there for her, more than you know. She cherished your friendship, Midoriya. Please don't blame yourself." But how could he not? The signs had been there, subtle but present, and yet he had missed them. He had been so focused on his own struggles, his own ambitions, that he had failed to see the darkness creeping into Aiko's life. The thought tore at him, a relentless guilt that he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. Inko, standing beside him, wrapped her arms around her son, her own tears flowing freely. She held him close, her sobs muffled against his shoulder as she tried to offer him the comfort he so desperately needed. Midoriya clung to her, his own tears finally spilling over as the reality of Aiko's death settled deep into his heart. The funeral service itself was a blur. Words of farewell were spoken, flowers were laid, and the finality of it all pressed heavily on Midoriya's chest. As he stood by Aiko's grave, the cold wind biting at his cheeks, he could barely see through the haze of his tears. The jacket Aiko had given him was wrapped tightly around him, its fabric absorbing the cold and offering him some semblance of warmth in a world that suddenly felt unbearably cold. As the day wore on, Midoriya felt a profound emptiness, a void left by Aiko's departure that nothing could fill. He clung to the coat as if it were a lifeline, a tangible piece of Aiko that he could hold on to in the midst of his grief. The pain of her loss was sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it was a flicker of determination. He would not let Aiko's memory fade. He would honor her by striving to be the kind of friend she had always been to him, kind, understanding, and always there when it mattered most. The lessons he had learned from their friendship would stay with him, guiding him as he moved forward. As he walked away from the cemetery, the wind howling through the barren trees, Midoriya made a silent vow. He would carry Aiko's spirit with him, a guiding light through the darkness. Her coat, warm, would remain a cherished possession, a reminder of the friend he had lost and the promise he would keep to live his life in a way that would make her proud. And as he faced the future, one filled with uncertainty and challenges, Midoriya knew that Aiko would always be with him, her memory a constant source of strength in the days ahead. Midoriya's silent struggle. Midoriya had always been a bit of an outcast, but after Aiko's death, he pulled away from others even more. The bustling hallways of his middle school, once filled with chatter, laughter, and the typical chaos of youth, now felt like a suffocating silence to him. Without Aiko by his side, her quiet strength and unwavering support, the school felt like a different place, one that was cold and uninviting. He noticed that the other students, who had once avoided him because of his association with Aiko, were beginning to approach him again. But their intentions weren't rooted in genuine interest or concern. They saw an opportunity, a chance to regain their sense of normalcy by welcoming Midoriya back into their fold, as if Aiko's absence somehow made him more acceptable. To them, with Aiko gone, Midoriya had the potential to regain the popularity he once held before he started spending time with the quirkless girl. But the idea of returning to that shallow, quirk-centered world repulsed him. Conversations with classmates felt empty, their praise for his quirk hollow, and the attention he received was tainted by the memory of Aiko's struggles. Whenever someone tried to engage him in casual talk, his mind would drift back to Aiko, to the times they spent together, to the way she had been treated by these same people. The hypocrisy was unbearable. He started rejecting invitations to hang out after school, avoiding social gatherings, and spending more time alone. The solitude, once filled with the warmth of Aiko's presence, now felt like a cold, unyielding void. He would sit in the library, where they used to study together, feeling the emptiness in the seat beside him. He would walk through the park, where they would talk about their dreams, and feel the weight of the silence that now hung in the air. His heart ached every time he passed by the places they used to frequent, the park bench where they would sit for hours, the library where they shared notes and ideas, and the corner of the schoolyard where Iko had first given him the jacket. He still wore it, the thick autumn coat that was several sizes too big, a constant reminder of the friend he had lost. It was a physical representation of her care for him, something she had given him to protect him from the cold, both literally and metaphorically. The jacket became more than just an article of clothing. It was a shield, a barrier between him and the world. It protected him from the cold, yes, but it also served as a buffer from the pain, the grief, and the overwhelming sense of loss that threatened to consume him. The sight of it, the feel of it against his skin, was a daily reminder of Iko, of her kindness, her struggles, and the bond they shared. He could still hear her voice in his head, see her smile, and feel the weight of her sadness in the way she had started saying goodbye instead of her usual "see you later." The subtle change in her words haunted him, a quiet cry for help that he had missed. He wondered how he could have been so blind, so caught up in his own life that he failed to see the signs of her growing despair. As time passed, Midoriya found himself visiting Aiko's grave often, talking to her as if she were still there. He would sit by her grave for hours, telling her about his struggles with the UA applications, the pressure he felt, and how much he missed her. He would tell her about the classes he was taking, the new techniques he was learning, and how hard he was working to fulfill his dream of becoming a hero. But all of it felt hollow without her there to share it with. He wished he had noticed the signs earlier, that he had been more aware of her pain. He wished he had done something, anything, to help her. But the truth was, he had been too caught up in his own stress, too focused on the future, to see that Iko was slipping away. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure to protect the one person who had always stood by him. The more the guilt grew, the more Midoriya distanced himself from others. He couldn't bear the thought of letting anyone else close, of losing someone else he cared about. So he retreated further into himself, wearing the oversized jacket like armor, as if it could protect him from the pain of loss. He became quieter, more withdrawn, his once bright eyes now clouded with sorrow. Inko, ever the worrier, noticed her son's change in behavior. She saw the way he avoided eye contact, the way he shrugged off her questions about school, and how he spent more time alone in his room. She cried happy tears when he did manage to open up a little, but those moments were becoming rarer. She tried to reach out to him, to comfort him, but there was a distance between them now, a barrier she couldn't seem to break through. Midoriya was in mourning, not just for Iko, but for the person he had been when she was alive. He wasn't sure who he was without her, and the uncertainty frightened him. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of grief and guilt, unsure of how to move forward. But he pressed on, burying himself in his studies, clinging to the hope that maybe, one day, he could live up to the promise he had made to Iko, to become a hero, not just in quirk, but in heart. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Midoriya's isolation became more pronounced. The world around him continued to turn, but for him, time had frozen on that day in the park when Iko had given him the jacket. He held on to that memory, replaying it over and over, wishing he could go back and change things, wishing he could have saved her. But there was no going back. There was only forward, and Midoriya knew that if he was going to honor Aiko's memory, he had to find a way to keep moving forward, no matter how much it hurt. He knew he had to become the hero she believed he could be, not just for himself, but for her. It was the only way he could make amends for his failure, the only way he could find some semblance of peace. And so, with the weight of his grief on his shoulders and the jacket as his shield, Midoriya set his sights on UA high. He would succeed, not just for himself, but for Iko. He would become the hero she had always believed he could be, no matter the cost. The break between middle school and high school was supposed to be a time of transition and anticipation, but for Midoriya, it was a period marred by grief and the relentless pursuit of his goal. As he trained for the UA High entrance exam, the shadow of Aiko's death loomed over him, a constant reminder of his loss and the promise he had made. The days were long and the nights even longer, with Midoriya dedicating himself to rigorous training and study. His routine was unyielding: wake up before dawn, train until exhaustion, and then study until the early hours of the morning. The physical and mental toll was immense, but it was the only way he knew to cope with the emptiness that had taken root in his heart. Midoriya's usual training grounds were now a quiet, secluded area on the outskirts of town. It was a place where he could push himself without the distractions of everyday life. The familiar comfort of Iko's jacket, worn almost constantly, became a beacon of warmth in his otherwise cold and lonely world. As he trained, he could feel the weight of her absence more acutely, the empty space beside him, the silence where her laughter used to be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, Midoriya stood alone in the open field, his breath forming frosty clouds in the chilly air. His muscles ached from hours of relentless training, but he pushed through, driven by the need to honor Iko's memory. Sweat mingled with tears as he focused on perfecting his quirk, each burst of energy a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating grief that clung to him. He paused to catch his breath, sitting down on a nearby rock. The jacket, now worn and frayed at the edges, lay across his shoulders. He took it off and spread it out beside him, running his fingers over the familiar fabric. It was as if, in some small way, it kept Iko close to him, her presence lingering in the warmth it provided. Midoriya closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of vulnerability. The memories of Iko played in his mind, the way she smiled, the sound of her voice, and the quiet moments they had shared. Each memory was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of what he had lost and the future they would never have. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a message from his mother, Inko, checking in on him. He had been distant lately, and she worried about his well-being. With a sigh, Midoriya picked up the phone and typed a quick response, assuring her he was fine and just busy with training. The truth was, he was far from fine. The pressure of the entrance exam and the weight of his grief were taking their toll. Every time he pushed himself to the brink, he was reminded of Iko's final words, her silent goodbye echoing in his mind. It was a constant reminder of his failure to see her pain, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility to not only succeed for himself but to fulfill the promise he had made to her. As he prepared to leave for the night, Midoriya paused and looked up at the stars. They seemed so distant, much like his hopes for the future had felt since Iko's death. But amidst the cold and darkness, he saw a glimmer of hope. He remembered Iko's belief in him, her faith in his potential to become a hero. That faith was a guiding light, one that he clung to fiercely even as he struggled with his own doubts. The next day, Midoriya resumed his training with renewed determination. The pain of Iko's loss was still there, a heavy burden he carried with him, but it was now intertwined with his drive to succeed. Each day of practice, every effort to improve, was done with the intention of honoring her memory. He worked on his stamina, focusing on the precision and control of his quirk. He practiced tirelessly, pushing through the exhaustion with the thought of Iko's unwavering support. Every time he faltered, he imagined her voice encouraging him, reminding him of the strength she had always seen in him. One particularly grueling session, as he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, he felt a surge of determination wash over him. It was as if Iko's spirit was urging him to keep going, to push past his limits and strive for greatness. With a final, deep breath, he picked himself up and continued, driven by the memory of his friend and the promise he had made to live up to her expectations. The harsh sunlight of summer beat down on the training grounds, casting long shadows as Bakugo also worked tirelessly to get into UA, his movements a blur of raw, explosive power. The UA entrance exam loomed large in his mind, a constant reminder of the future he was determined to seize. Yet beneath the surface of his gruff exterior and relentless training, a storm of conflicting emotions churned. Iko's death had hit him harder than he cared to admit. His parents, who remained uninformed about the breakdown in the friendship of Bakugo and Midoriya, brought him to the funeral thinking they were a trio who hung out a lot. The news had come as a shock, and Bakugo's initial response was one of anger, not only at the world but at himself. He had never really known Iko, only that she was a quiet, quirkless girl who had sometimes been in his way. His harsh words and demeanor had been a part of his usual bravado, something he rarely thought twice about. But now, the impact of those words felt like a heavy weight around his chest, an unshakable burden that gnawed at him every day. In the privacy of his training area, Bakugo's explosive power was a cathartic release, his quirk roaring with the intensity of his inner turmoil. But even as he threw himself into his workouts, the image of Iko's tearful goodbye and the news of her suicide haunted him. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless whisper that questioned his own humanity. As he took a break, sitting on the edge of the training ground, Bakugo clenched his fists, staring at the ground with a scowl. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, struggling to reconcile his feelings with the image he had of himself. "It wasn't my fault," he muttered to himself, his voice rough and edged with frustration. "She made her own choices. It's not like I knew what was going on with her. I didn't drive her to do that. I didn't." But deep down, Bakugo couldn't fully believe the words he was trying to convince himself of. He knew he had been harsh, had made Aiko's life harder. The guilt was a constant companion, reminding him of his own flaws and failures. On the other hand, Bakugo was fiercely determined not to let this guilt define him. "No, I'm not a bad person," he growled, his voice cracking with the strain of his internal conflict. "She chose that herself. I had nothing to do with it. I'm gonna make something of myself. I'm gonna be a hero, and this doesn't change that." He drove his training harder, using the pain and frustration as fuel. Every explosion was a cathartic release, a way to drown out the guilt and anger that threatened to overwhelm him. He pushed his body to its limits, hoping that in the process, he could somehow outrun the shadows of his own regret. In the evenings, when he wasn't training, Bakugo would sit alone in his room, surrounded by the textbooks and study materials for the UA entrance exam. The quiet of the night was often filled with the echoes of his own thoughts, the harshness of his self-criticism mingling with the weight of his guilt. He tried to focus on his studies, but even there, the memories of Aiko and the sense of responsibility for her death lingered. He could still hear the murmurs of his classmates, the whispers of what they had said about Aiko and the way they had treated her. It all felt like a haunting reminder of the impact of his actions, however indirect. The pressure of the entrance exam felt secondary to the pressure of his own conscience. Despite the turmoil, Bakugo was determined to channel his pain into something productive. He threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he applied to his training. He wasn't just preparing for the entrance exam, he was trying to prove something to himself. He was trying to prove that he could be more than the harsh words he had spoken, more than the boy who had caused someone to commit suicide. The words and formulas blurred together as he flipped through his textbooks, but his resolve remained clear. He would not let Aiko's memory be tainted his dreams. He would move past her death. Midoriya dragged his feet through the crowded shopping district, the buzz of weekend activities swirling around him. His mother had insisted that he take the day off, citing her concern over how hard he had been pushing himself lately. Reluctantly, he had agreed, though every fiber of his being screamed that he should be at home, training, studying, doing anything productive. But here he was, forced to wander aimlessly through the city, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety that came with not doing enough. He pulled Aiko's coat tighter around himself, the familiar fabric a small comfort against the chill in the air. It had been months since her death, but the weight of her absence felt as heavy as ever. It was days like this, when he was alone with his thoughts, that the grief threatened to swallow him whole. He had thrown himself into training, into preparing for the UA entrance exam, in a desperate attempt to fill the void, but the pain lingered just beneath the surface, ready to surge forward at any moment. As he turned a corner, his eyes scanned the area without much interest until they landed on a familiar figure. His heart stopped. Bakugo Katsuki stood on the opposite side of the street, surrounded by a group of rowdy boys, their laughter cutting through the air. Midoriya froze, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't seen Bakugo since Aiko's death, since everything had changed. Seeing him now, in the middle of a bustling crowd, brought a flood of emotions crashing over him. Anger. Resentment. Hatred. Midoriya had never hated anyone before, not truly. But now, as he watched Bakugo laugh and shove his friends around like nothing had happened, the emotion flared up inside him like a wildfire. He could feel it, burning hot and bright, threatening to consume him. Aiko was gone, and Bakugo was still here, living his life as if her death meant nothing. The rational part of Midoriya knew that Bakugo wasn't solely to blame for what happened to Aiko. But the more emotional side of him couldn't help but fixate on Bakugo's cruelty, the way he had tormented her, belittled her, made her feel like she was worthless. Midoriya clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He could almost hear Bakugo's voice in his head, mocking, jeering, pushing Aiko closer and closer to the edge. Across the street, Bakugo suddenly looked up, his gaze locking onto Midoriya's. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a silent, tense standoff. Midoriya could see the flash of recognition in Bakugo's eyes, the slight narrowing of his brow as if he was trying to figure out what Midoriya was thinking. But he wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing. Midoriya tore his gaze away, turning sharply on his heel and disappearing into the crowd. As he walked away, his heart pounding in his chest, Midoriya felt the hatred simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. He didn't know what to do with it, how to process it, how to move forward with this new, unfamiliar emotion. All he knew was that he couldn't stand the sight of Bakugo, couldn't stand the thought of what he had done, and the fact that he would never have to face the consequences. Bakugo's perspective. Bakugo Katsuki had been told by his mother to take a break, a command he had begrudgingly obeyed. His training regimen had been relentless, his focus on UA unwavering, but the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. His mother's sharp tongue had finally gotten the best of him, and so, he found himself here, surrounded by his so-called friends, trying to drown out the thoughts that had been plaguing him for weeks. Aiko. The name was like a bitter pill, lodged in his throat, refusing to be swallowed. He hadn't meant for things to go this far, hadn't meant to push her over the edge. But she was weak, and weakness disgusted him. He had only ever wanted to make her realize how pointless it was to cling to her dreams without a quirk. He hadn't expected her to give up entirely, to end it all. No, he hadn't expected that. But hadn't he known, deep down, that his words had a power over people? That his cruelty could cut deeper than any blade? He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. It wasn't his fault. It couldn't be his fault. She was just too weak to handle the truth. But no matter how many times he told himself that, the guilt lingered. It was like a shadow, always there, always lurking, ready to pounce when his defenses were down. He could still see her face, pale and lifeless, every time he closed his eyes. He could hear her voice, so small, so fragile, breaking under the weight of his words. He was Bakugo Katsuki, damn it. He was supposed to be the strongest, the best. But what kind of hero made a girl take her own life? The thought gnawed at him, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed image of himself that he had built over the years. As he laughed along with his friends, shoving them around, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest, he looked up and saw Midoriya across the street. The sight of him was like a punch to the gut. The look in Midoriya's eyes was something he had never seen before, hatred, pure and unfiltered. Bakugo stiffened, his laughter dying in his throat. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Midoriya's gaze was like a mirror, reflecting back all the things he didn't want to see, the guilt, the shame, the regret. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he couldn't. Midoriya's hatred was a physical force, pushing against him, suffocating him. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. Midoriya turned away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Bakugo standing there, his heart racing, his mind a jumbled mess of thoughts and emotions. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that Midoriya was just a weakling who didn't understand what it took to be strong. But the look in Midoriya's eyes haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind. He could feel the cracks in his facade, the carefully constructed persona he had built starting to crumble under the weight of his guilt. No, he told himself, this doesn't make me a bad person. I'm not to blame for her choices. She was weak, and that's all there is to it. But even as he tried to convince himself, the doubt lingered, festering like an open wound. He could feel it, growing inside him, threatening to consume him if he let his guard down for even a moment. As the day wore on, Bakugo found himself walking away from his friends, the laughter and noise fading into the background. He needed to be alone, needed to think, to figure out how to make this go away. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that Midoriya's hatred had unlocked something inside him that he wasn't ready to face. And as he walked through the city, the weight of his guilt heavy on his shoulders, Bakugo couldn't help but wonder if he would ever be able to outrun it, or if it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The morning of the UA entrance exam was cool and crisp, as if the world itself had settled into a quiet tension, just like Midoriya. His breath puffed out in small, visible clouds, not just from the cold but because of his quirk's chilling effect. His constant cold reminded him of what was on the line today. Months of training, sleepless nights studying, pushing his body past its limits, all of it led to this moment. Midoriya sat there looking up at the building. He probably would have been like that for longer. He tugged his jacket tighter around himself, as much for comfort as for warmth. Every step he took toward Yue's imposing gates echoed with the reminder of the promise he'd made. Aiko, he thought, feeling the familiar pang of her absence. The bittersweet memory of her teasing voice filled his mind, her words from months ago haunting him. Midoriya swallowed hard, trying to push the lump in his throat back down. He wasn't going to let her down. Not after everything. I'll become the hero we dreamed of. For you, Aiko, he vowed silently. His thoughts carried him forward, feet moving automatically as he approached the large crowd gathered at the gates. His mind was so focused on Aiko's words and his own racing heartbeat that he didn't see the crack in the pavement until it was too late. Midoriya's foot caught on the uneven stone, and before he could react, he was falling forward. Panic shot through him as he realized his face was about to meet the concrete. Of course, he thought, a mixture of irony and dread filling him. She said I'd trip. You're going to trip. I can feel it, Aiko had said, her tone lighthearted but teasing. But don't worry. You'll pick yourself up and become a hero. I know you will. But just as quickly as the fear came, a strange, weightless sensation took over. Instead of hitting the ground, Midoriya found himself floating, his body gently hovering above the pavement. You okay? A bright, cheerful voice asked. Midoriya blinked, startled, and glanced up to see a girl with short brown hair and big, round eyes grinning down at him. She held up her fingers in a strange way, almost like a little gesture of victory. He realized she must have used her quirk to save him. Why yeah. I'm fine, Midoriya stammered, pushing himself back onto his feet as the girl lowered him to the ground. His heart was still pounding from the fall, but now, his face flushed with embarrassment. She saved me, he thought. The girl smiled warmly. Good. Wouldn't want you starting the day with a faceplant. She waved goodbye, already moving toward the entrance. Midoriya stood frozen for a moment, watching her leave, a bit too stunned to move. That was really nice of her, he thought, feeling slightly dazed. He shook his head quickly, trying to refocus. No distractions, Midoriya. Today is too important. You need to focus. Taking a deep breath, he walked through the gates of UA, his mind briefly drifting back to Aiko's words. For you, Aiko, he reaffirmed the promise as he stepped forward. The exam hall was massive, filled with hundreds of students, all vying for a spot at UA. Midoriya sat down at one of the desks for the written portion, clutching his pencil like it was a lifeline. He had studied for this. Hours and hours of cramming in every possible fact about hero laws, quirk regulations, villain classifications, everything. His heart hammered in his chest, and the anxiety buzzed just beneath his skin. Just as he sat down, he caught a glimpse of someone sliding into the seat next to him. He blinked. It was the same girl who had saved him from tripping earlier. Hey, she chirped, a bright smile on her face. Looks like we're test buddies now, huh? Midoriya froze for a moment, surprised that she was talking to him again. Yeah. I guess so. His words came out awkwardly, his voice cracking slightly. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this, casually. Usually they avoided him or he avoided them. I'm Ochako Uraraka, she introduced herself, holding out her hand with a friendly smile. Yazuko Midoriya, he stuttered, hesitantly shaking her hand. His own was clammy, and he hoped she didn't notice how cold his skin felt. Nice to meet you, Ochako said, her tone bright and cheerful. This whole exam thing is kinda nerve-wracking, huh? Midoriya nodded quickly, his mind racing. She's so calm, he thought, feeling a pang of envy. Why, it's really intense. He fidgeted with his pencil, not sure what else to say. Ochako smiled, seemingly unaffected by his awkwardness. Well, we've just gotta give it our best, right? Before Midoriya could respond, the proctors called for silence, signaling the start of the exam. He glanced at Ochako, who gave him a thumbs up before turning to her own test. Midoriya stood in the ready area for the UA practical exam, his nerves fraying as the seconds ticked down. He tried to steady his breathing, but every deep inhale seemed to make his chest tighter. The crowd of hopeful students around him only added to the pressure, and his mind started to spiral. This is it. The last part, his hands trembled slightly as the cold of his quirk seeped from his fingertips, chilling the air around him. If I mess this up, I won't just fail, I'll blow my one chance to get into UA. The knot in his stomach tightened. His thoughts raced, what if I freeze up? What if I can't keep up? What if everyone's stronger? Better? Faster? He could already picture the disappointment, the looks of pity from the pro heroes, the students who would breeze through while he was left behind. His legs felt like ice, both from his quirk and the panic gripping his body. I can't mess this up. I can't, Just as Midoriya was about to completely lose himself to his thoughts, he saw a familiar face approach out of the corner of his eye. It was Ochako Uraraka, her expression warm and friendly as she walked toward him. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope that she might offer some comfort, some reassurance. But before she could reach him, ᴡᴇ'ʟ's hand shot out, blocking her path. "Excuse me," Ida said, his voice firm. "This is hardly the time for distractions. We're about to take a highly competitive and serious exam. It would be unbecoming of a future hero to interrupt someone's focus right now." Uraraka blinked, surprised, her hand lowering. "I wasn't trying to. As future heroes, we must maintain a certain level of decorum." Ida interrupted, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Her lips pressed together in frustration, but with a resigned sigh, she nodded and backed away. Midoriya, unaware of the near interaction, continued to spiral internally. "I'm not ready. What if I can't control my quirk properly? What if I'm not fast enough?" His heart pounded in his chest. He tried to steady himself, but the looming dread wouldn't let go. I can't fail. I just can't, The countdown to the start of the exam felt like a death sentence. The weight of the challenge ahead, proving he was capable of becoming a hero, bore down on him with crushing intensity. He hadn't gotten any relief. He hadn't shaken the anxiety from the written exam. In fact, the thought of having done the written part wrong only compounded his fears for the practical. As the starting signal blared, Midoriya launched forward with the others, his feet hitting the ground hard. His body moved on instinct, but his mind was a blur of panic. When the practical exam finally began, Midoriya stood with the other students, staring out at the simulated city that lay before them. The buildings were tall and imposing, and the tension in the air was palpable. President Mick's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, explaining the rules. The goal was simple: take down as many robot villains as possible in the time given. But it wasn't as simple as it sounded. The robots were designed to simulate real villains, with different levels of strength and danger. Midoriya felt his palms grow cold, his breath coming out in small clouds again as his quirk stirred beneath the surface. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had trained for this. He had prepared. He could do this. As soon as the gates opened, chaos erupted. Students sprinted forward, using their quirks in dazzling displays of power. Robots were felled left and right by fire, explosions. Midoriya found himself frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of it all. "Focus," he told himself. "Stay calm." He chose his targets carefully, aiming for the bigger robots. He could freeze the robots' joints, rendering them immobile. It was precise, efficient. He moved through the city, dodging debris and robots, each successful freeze building his confidence. For a while, it felt like he was doing well, really well, in fact. For the smaller ones, a few icicles through the chest usually worked pretty, but his strategy worked. As the minutes ticked by, he took down several robots, freezing them solid in key places. His heart soared with hope. He was doing so well. Midoriya stood among the chaos, his breath misting in the air as the simulation city rumbled around him. He had taken down several robots, using his quirk to freeze their joints and disable them. His body was tired, his arms and legs aching from the constant effort of maneuvering through the debris and robot attacks. But for the first time, a small spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, I was good enough. He allowed himself a moment to revel in the possibility that he might have passed the entrance exam. For a brief second, he imagined standing at the gates of UA as a student, one step closer to fulfilling the promise he made to Aiko. But that hope was abruptly shattered by a deafening roar. Boom! The ground shook violently, sending Midoriya stumbling forward. His eyes shot upward, and his stomach dropped as he saw the massive shape looming above him. It was the ᴅᴜᴄᴏᴍᴇ monstrous, towering robot designed to be an insurmountable obstacle. The ᴅᴜᴄᴏ was easily several stories tall, its limbs creaking with the weight of destruction as it plowed through the simulated city like it was made of paper. Students fled in every direction, some crying out in fear, others yelling warnings to their peers. What? Midoriya stammered, frozen to the spot as he watched the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ crash through buildings, sending debris raining down on the streets. The students running past him, who was paralyzed in fear at the current moment, blurred in the background. There was no way to fight this thing. It was meant to be a deterrent, a test of who knew when to flee, rather than fight. No points could be earned from taking it down, and facing it directly would be foolish. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out of the way like everyone else. But then, amidst the noise, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A scream for help. Midoriya whipped his head around, scanning the streets below. Among the crumbled debris, he saw a figure pinned under a pile of rubble. A blonde-haired boy, clearly struggling to move. His arm was trapped, and the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ was looming dangerously close. He's going to be crushed. Without thinking, Midoriya's legs moved on their own. He sprinted toward the boy, heart pounding in his chest as the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ's massive foot came crashing down closer and closer. The boy's terrified eyes met his, and Midoriya knew that he was running out of time. From the corner of his eye, he saw a familiar figure racing toward the scene as well, Ochako, the girl who had saved him earlier. She was moving fast, her face determined. I'll help him get free. Ochako yelled as she reached the blonde boy, quickly using her quirk to make the debris around him weightless. You hold off that thing. Midoriya didn't hesitate, he didn't have a choice. He had to do something. If the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ stepped on them, it was over. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, hands trembling as he focused all his energy into summoning the ice from the earth. His breath came out in rapid, frosty puffs as he concentrated on the space just beneath the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ's foot. Come on, you can do this, asterisk. A massive pillar of ice erupted from the pavement, shooting upward with incredible force. The ice was thick and solid, and it struck the underside of the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ's foot just in time, stopping it from descending any further. The robot's foot wobbled in place, the joints groaning under the strain of the ice. Midoriya clenched his teeth, forcing more energy into his quirk, reinforcing the ice pillar as cracks started to form along its surface. His legs shook, his arms trembling from the effort of keeping it upright. Just hold a little longer. Behind him, Ochako had managed to free the boy, lifting the rubble with her quirk and pulling him out from underneath. The blonde boy, still dazed, blinked up at her in surprise. Can you move? She asked urgently, helping him to his feet. Why, yeah. I think so, he muttered, his voice shaky. Good, let's go. Ochako urged, dragging him away from the danger zone as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Midoriya's body was nearing its limit. His ice pillar was barely holding up the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ's weight, the cracks spreading rapidly across its surface. He could feel his energy depleting, his quirk starting to falter under the immense strain. I can't hold it much longer. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands still pressed against the ground. The ice pillar shuddered one last time before finally cracking apart, shards of ice raining down as the ᴅᴜᴄᴏ's foot crashed through. He had held it just long enough. Ochako and the boy were already clear, safely out of harm's way. Once they were safely away from the destruction, Midoriya collapsed fully onto the pavement, panting heavily. His jacket was soaked with sweat, and his hands were shaking from the cold. Ochako knelt beside him, her face flushed but relieved. Why you did it, Ochako said, a grin spreading across her face. You stopped it. Midoriya shook his head weakly, still catching his breath. I just slowed it down, he murmured, his voice trembling. YUS saved him. The blond boy, who had been watching the exchange silently, finally spoke up, a sheepish grin on his face. Yeah, thanks, man. That was, crazy cool. I thought I was toast. He scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Name's Kaminari, by the way, thanks. Midoriya's anxiety flared up instantly. He glanced at Denki, his eyes wide, then quickly looked away, fumbling for words. It's fine, he stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. His voice was quieter this time, more awkward, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He quickly stood up on shaky legs, eager to leave the situation behind. Oh really, it's fine. The trio made their way to the nurse, with Midoriya and Ochako supporting Denki between them. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, Midoriya felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Denki was safe, and they had made it through the exam. As they approached the medical tent, Recovery Girl was already waiting for them, her eyes soft with concern. Well, you sure had an exciting first day, didn't you? She muttered, her hands glowing as she prepared to heal the injuries. Come on, let's get you all patched up. Denki, still trying to process everything, let out a small laugh. Yeah, no kidding. I'm never looking at robots the same way again. Midoriya stood silently as Recovery Girl worked, his thoughts drifting back to Aiko's promise. He had made it through the day, he had done what a hero was supposed to do. Even though his heart was racing and his body was aching, he felt that spark of hope reignite inside him. Midoriya and Ochako left the medical tent side by side, heading for their respective homes, Denki waving behind them. Despite everything, there was a strange, undeniable feeling that he could be a hero. Izuku Midoriya stood in front of the towering gates of UA High School, the prestigious institution where the next generation of heroes would be forged. Despite the warmth of the late spring morning, Izuku was bundled up in a thick, dark green jacket that clung to his slender frame. The cold that seeped from his very bones never truly left him, a constant reminder of the quirk he had lived with for as long as he could remember. This is it. I made it, Aiko he thought, staring up at the massive doors with a mixture of anticipation and anger. His hand clenched into a fist at his side as his heart beat with a steady, icy thrum. He had made it this far, further than anyone, even himself, had ever expected. But as he adjusted the collar of his jacket, he couldn't shake the chill of resentment that crawled through his chest. Today wasn't just the start of his journey as a hero, it was the first day of a new life, one where he would have to face not only the daunting challenges of UA but also the person who had tormented Aiko, his childhood friend turned tyrant, Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku's jaw tightened at the thought of Bakugo. The memories of Aiko's tears, of her small, trembling frame, were burned into his mind like a brand. Aiko, like a sister to him, had always looked up to him, and Bakugo had torn her down with cruel words and reckless violence. She had never deserved that. No one did. As the entrance ceremony began, Izuku's mind was elsewhere. The speeches blurred into white noise as he kept his gaze low, shadowed by the hood of his jacket. The words hero course echoed in his thoughts like a challenge, a taunt that dared him to fail, but he wouldn't. Not anymore. When the ceremony ended, the students of Class 1A were ushered into their classroom, the hum of excited chatter filling the air. Izuku chose a seat near the back, as far from the front as possible. He didn't want to be seen, not yet. Not until he had more control, not until he could face Bakugo without wanting to freeze everything around him. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, fueled by the familiar cold that never left him. His breath hitched when he saw it, when he entered the room. Katsuki Bakugo getting yelled at by Ida for having his feet on the desk. The moment Bakugo saw him, it was as if the air around Izuku dropped another 10 degrees. His fingers clenched tighter, the cold spreading through his veins like ice water. Bakugo's skull was ever present, his arrogant posture unshaken. He looked the same as always, brash, angry, and full of himself. But to Izuku, he looked smaller than before, no longer the unstoppable force he had once seemed. Izuku's green eyes burned with cold fury as their gazes met. For the first time in years, he didn't feel indifference and maybe a tinge of disappointment when looking at Bakugo. He felt anger. pure, unrelenting anger. But Bakugo, in his typical fashion, didn't flinch. There was no recognition, no sign of guilt for what he had done. He turned away without a word, moving to sit in an open seat. Izuku exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the warm room, a reminder of the chill that followed him everywhere. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer effort it took to keep himself from standing up and confronting Bakugo then and there. Their homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa, appeared shortly after. His unkempt hair and tired eyes gave the impression of a man who hadn't slept in days. Without much ceremony, he introduced himself and immediately launched into what would be their first real challenge, the Quirk apprehension test. "Forget about orientation or getting to know each other," Aizawa said, his voice monotone yet carrying a weight that silenced the room. "You're here to become heroes, so let's see if you're up to the task." Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. A test already? He had barely settled into his seat, and now he was expected to show off his quirk in front of everyone. The icy grip of anxiety wrapped around him, but something else was there too: determination. He wasn't going to let Bakugo overshadow him. Not anymore. Outside, the class stood in a wide-open field, the heat of the day pressing down on them. Izuku tugged at the sleeves of his jacket, feeling the familiar coldness of his skin beneath. The temperature never bothered him, but today, under the gaze of his classmates, it felt more obvious than ever. "Alright, we're going to start with a simple set of tests," Aizawa began, his eyes scanning the group. 50-meter dash, grip strength, long jump, ball throw, and more. You'll use your quirks however you see fit to get the best results. Aizawa pointed at Bakugo. "You got the best score in the entrance exam. You go first. Ball throw." Bakugo stepped up confidently, gripping the ball tightly in his hand. Izuku's eyes narrowed as he watched. His stomach churned with disdain. Bakugo used his explosion quirk, launching the ball far into the distance with a fiery burst that left scorch marks in the grass. 524.7 meters. Bakugo grinned smugly, happy with his own score. One by one, the students took their turns. Todoroki, with his own ice powers, excelled with ease. Kirishima and Mina Ashido performed admirably, using their quirks to boost their physical feats. Then it was Midoriya's turn. "Midoriya," Aizawa called, jolting him from his thoughts. "You're up next." Izuku nodded and stepped forward, trying to ignore the stares of his classmates. The first test was the 50-meter dash. He took his place at the starting line, his breath visible in the warm air as he exhaled slowly. The cold emanated from his body, chilling the ground beneath his feet. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the simmering anger that still lingered beneath the surface. "Ready, go." Izuku surged forward, ice crackling beneath his shoes as he propelled himself with his quirk. His breath came in sharp bursts, the air around him turning frigid as he pushed himself faster. He crossed the finish line in just under 4 seconds, a respectable time, but not the fastest. He didn't care about being the fastest. He just cared about doing his best. As the tests progressed, Izuku did his best to hold his own. His grip strength was average, the long jump was easier with a layer of frost forming under his shoes, giving him a bit of extra lift. But each use of his quirk drained him, the cold settling deeper into his bones with every exertion. As the test concluded, the students gathered around Aizawa, who reviewed their results with his usual impassive expression. Izuku felt a flicker of hope. He hadn't been the best, but he hadn't been the worst either. He had held his own, despite the odds. "None of you are being expelled today, it was a logical ruse to draw out your full potential," Aizawa announced, much to the relief of the entire class. "But don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning." Izuku exhaled slowly, his breath turning to mist in the warm air. He had survived the first day, but he knew this was only the start of a long, arduous journey. The path to becoming a hero was going to be colder and more challenging than he had ever imagined. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of confidence. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. As the students dispersed, Izuku caught Bakugo looking at him out of the corner of his eye. The blonde was staring, his eyes fixed on Izuku with an intensity that made Izuku's stomach churn. But this time, it wasn't the usual fear or anxiety that gripped him, it was anger. "You don't get to look at me like that," Bakugo Izuku's thoughts burned with icy rage. "Not after what you did to Aiko." Bakugo's expression was unreadable, but Izuku could see the arrogance in his posture, the way he carried himself as if the world owed him something. Without a word, Bakugo turned away, as if Izuku wasn't even worth his time. But Izuku wasn't that same kid anymore. He wasn't the boy Bakugo could bully and torment. He's stronger now, and he was going to use it to become the hero he was meant to be. This is just the beginning, he reminded himself as he walked away, the cold of his quirk a constant companion. But even as the chill seeped through his body, he couldn't help but feel a small, warm spark of determination igniting within. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next day, Izuku Midoriya found himself with a bit of downtime as the teacher hasn't arrived yet. The brisk air nipped at his skin, it still registered through the layers of his ever-present jacket. As he made his way to Class 1A, he tried to focus on the day ahead, but the events of the entrance exam kept replaying in his mind. Saving Kaminari and not being expelled yesterday, it didn't seem real. Inside the classroom, his classmates were already seated, filling the air with chatter and excitement. Katsuki Bakugo sat near the back, leaning back with his arms crossed, looking as if he couldn't care less about being there. Shoto Todoroki, with his striking red and white hair, stared out the window, his expression unreadable. Mina Ashido's bright laughter rang out as she teased Denki, who looked just as lively as ever despite the narrow escape during the entrance exam. Others like Ida were seated primly, waiting for the day's lessons with a serious expression. Midoriya, trying to blend in, moved quietly to his seat. He had barely sat down when a cheerful voice called out to him. "Hey, Midoriya." He turned to see Uraraka and Kaminari hurrying over, her bright smile lighting up the room. "Thanks you again for helping me save him back during the exam," she exclaimed with enthusiasm. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." Midoriya's face flushed red as he waved his hands awkwardly. "And no, it wasn't anything really. I just did what I see could." Ochako laughed, waving off his modesty. "You were amazing, Midoriya. We make a great team. I'm so glad we're in the same class. We should be friends for real." Why you're welcome," Midoriya mumbled, overwhelmed by her sudden enthusiasm. He had no idea how to respond to someone who was so excited to be his friend. The last time someone had cared about him like this had been Aiko. Before he could think about it any further, Denki Kaminari walked up with a grin. "Dude. Seriously, you were awesome during the exam. Freezing that robot like that? I didn't know you had that in you." He slapped Midoriya's back good-naturedly, causing Midoriya to flinch slightly. "Thanks, Kaminari," Midoriya managed to say, still a bit thrown by all the attention. "Hey," Denki added, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. "So, what's up with the jacket? You wore it all through the exam, and now you're wearing it today too. Isn't it a little hot for that?" The question sent a ripple through the room. Kirishima, who had been chatting with Mina, looked over with interest. "Yeah, man, I was wondering about that too. Is that, like, your hero costume or something?" I just run sea cold," Midoriya stammered, pulling the jacket closer to him, his eyes darting nervously around. Mina Ashido, leaning over her desk, tilted her head. "Run cold? What, like you're always freezing or something?" she asked, her wide, curious eyes studying him. Midoriya gave a small nod. Something like that. "That's kinda wild," Kaminari added, his grin not faltering. "But doesn't it get uncomfortable? Like, always being cold?" Midoriya shrugged awkwardly. I am used to it." Mina gave a playful smile. "Does that mean you never get hot? 'Cause that would be super useful in summer." Midoriya chuckled nervously, not sure how to respond, but before he could come up with anything, another voice joined the conversation. "Hey, don't forget how pale he is." Siro chimed in from the back, his tape-covered elbows resting on his desk. "You're like a vampire or something, right?" Midoriya flushed even deeper, looking down at his hands. "This is too much attention," he fidgeted with his jacket. I am used to it, Izuku said, shrugging off the concern. It was true, he had lived with the cold for so long that it had become a part of him, both physically and emotionally. Tsuyu, who was sitting nearby, chimed in with a thoughtful croak. That explains why your skin is so pale, Ribbit. Izuku nodded slightly. It's just how I am. Vampire. I knew it. Mina teased, leaning forward in her seat with a mischievous grin. Do you sparkle in the sunlight, Midoriya? That's kinda creepy, Mineta Minoru said with a nervous chuckle, earning him a glare from a few other classmates. Creepy or not, it's still his quirk, Kyokujiro added, her tone more understanding. Ochako, sensing his discomfort, gently cut in. Oh, come on, guys. Leave him alone about it. It's not a big deal, right? Midoriya smiled weakly at her. Thanks, Uraraka. Kaminari gave a half shrug. Alright. But still, man, you're kinda mysterious with that jacket. I'll figure you out eventually. The room settled down again as the teacher hadn't arrived yet, giving Midoriya a moment to catch his breath. But as the conversations around him returned to normal, his mind wandered back to Aiko. He couldn't help but feel that old familiar ache in his chest whenever he thought of her. You're going to be a hero, I believe in you, Izuku, she had said once, her voice filled with a confidence he had never quite understood. And when you make it, you'll do it for both of us. She had been so sure of it, so sure of him. The jacket he wore wasn't just to shield him from the cold, it was a reminder of his promise to her. Every time he felt the chill, every time he saw his pale skin in the mirror, he remembered her words, and they gave him strength. He was here at UA because of that promise, to be the hero Aiko always believed he could be. He glanced up as Ida approached him next, his serious expression softening slightly as he extended a hand. Midoriya, you performed exceptionally well during the exam. I'm glad we'll be studying together. Midoriya blinked, shaking Ida's hand awkwardly. Thanks, Ida. Why you too? Ochako jumped in again. And hey, with all of us working together, we'll become the best heroes ever. Kaminari grinned. Yeah, what she said. Stick with us, Midoriya. We're gonna make it. Midoriya smiled slightly, overwhelmed but starting to feel something else. Maybe this could be okay. Maybe I could belong here, Just as the bell rang and the conversations died down, Aizawa-sensei entered the room, his usual tired expression on his face as he called the class to order. Midoriya sat back in his chair, his heart still racing but with a new determination. He was here. He had survived the entrance exam. And now, with these new classmates around him, these new friends, he had a chance to be the hero he had promised Aiko he would become. As class got more confused about where the teacher was, the door burst open with a "I am walking through the door like a hero." It was All Might in his Silver Age costume. Today's exercise is simple. All Might exclaimed, his bright smile contrasting with the pressure settling on the students. The villain team will defend a fake bomb hidden inside a building, and the hero team's job is to capture it. Villains, your job is to protect the bomb for 15 minutes. Heroes, stop them before time runs out. The first match was decided. Midoriya and Ochako were assigned to the villain team, while Todoroki and Ida would be the heroes. As soon as the teams were announced, Midoriya's heart sank. His quirk, while useful in combat, wasn't as aggressive as Todoroki's. Todoroki had incredible power with his ice quirk, one that Midoriya knew could overwhelm almost anyone. Ida, on the other hand, had speed, something Midoriya and Ochako would have to counter strategically. All right, Midoriya, Ochako said with a determined smile as they stood in front of the mock building where the bomb was hidden. What's the plan? We just have to defend, right? Midoriya nodded, his green eyes flicking nervously between the various points in the building. The bomb was hidden deep inside, and they had limited options for fortification. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, feeling the cold creep up his spine. It wasn't just the atmosphere, it was the knowledge that Todoroki would likely rely on his ice, meaning the temperature was about to plummet. Yes, we need to hold them off for 15 minutes, Midoriya responded, chewing his lip in thought. Todoroki will probably try to freeze the building from the outside. We have to be ready to counter that. Counter Todoroki's ice? Ochako asked, eyebrows raised. Just let me handle it, Midoriya said, his voice more confident now. We might be able to stall him and Ida. You'll have to help me block off Ida's speed. If he can't run straight, we'll have more time. Ochako nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Got it, Izuku. I'll lift whatever I can to block him. That's time. Heroes begin. The exercise began, and the villain team had mere moments to prepare. Midoriya quickly stationed himself near the center of the building, his breath already visible in the cold air. He felt the chill around him intensify. It was only a matter of time before Todoroki made his first move. Ochako stood beside him, eyes alert as she waited for his instructions. And then, it happened. A massive wave of ice surged through the walls of the building, freezing the outer structure almost immediately. The temperature dropped so fast that Midoriya's fingers stiffened in his gloves. Todoroki wasn't holding back, his ice encased the entire building, sealing off exits and making movement difficult. The sheer volume of ice was overwhelming. Ochako gasped, her eyes widening as the cold surged in. Todoroki's not wasting any time. Midoriya clenched his fists, already focusing on his own quirk. His breath formed small clouds in front of him as he gathered the cold energy from within, letting it pulse through his veins. Slowly, deliberately, he began to counter the ice creeping through the walls. I can handle this, Midoriya said, his voice trembling, not from fear, but from the cold settling into his bones. Frost flickered at his fingertips, and with a sharp exhale, Midoriya sent a pulse of cold energy outward. His quirk didn't just control ice, it allowed him to manipulate and weaken it. He couldn't generate as much ice as Todoroki, but he could break apart what was already there. With each focused push, cracks appeared in the ice covering the building, breaking it into large chunks. Todoroki's ice is powerful, but if we break it apart like this, he'll have a harder time keeping control, Midoriya explained to Ochako. Ochako wasted no time. She tapped each of the fractured ice blocks, activating her zero-gravity quirk to lift them into the air. Large chunks of ice floated in midair, suspended above the floor, creating an obstacle course within the building. If Ida tried to rush in with his speed, he'd have to navigate through the hovering ice blocks, making it nearly impossible to run straight. Midoriya's eyes narrowed in concentration as he continued to break up Todoroki's ice. Each wave of cold energy he released caused more cracks to form, shattering the ice further. It was exhausting work, and he could feel the toll it was taking on his body. The cold wasn't just external, it seeped into his bones, slowing him down with each exertion. Outside, Todoroki frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. He could feel the resistance, his ice wasn't holding the way it normally did. Midoriya's controlling it, he muttered to himself. He didn't expect Midoriya to have such precise control over his ice. It was impressive, but Todoroki wasn't one to be deterred easily. Ida, I'll cover you with more ice. As soon as you see an opening, rush in and secure the bomb, Todoroki instructed, his voice calm but serious. Ida gave a sharp nod. Understood. Todoroki summoned another wave of ice, sending it crashing toward the building, hoping to overwhelm Midoriya's control. At the same time, Ida braced himself, his engines roaring to life as he prepared to sprint. When the ice began to shatter again, Ida dashed forward, navigating through the floating ice blocks with precision. But the unpredictable movements of the ice blocks slowed Ida down. Ochako had lifted so many that it created a near maze-like environment inside the building. Every time Ida tried to speed through, a floating block would bob in his path, forcing him to zigzag and lose momentum. Midoriya's heart raced as he watched Ida struggle to gain ground. It's working, he thought, though his body was beginning to shake from the cold. He had to hold on just a little longer. Ida's voice echoed in frustration, they're blocking my path. I can't get through fast enough. Despite the frustration, Ida continued to press forward. He was closing the distance, slowly but surely, navigating through the frozen maze. Meanwhile, Todoroki advanced from the other side of the building, using his ice to clear a path for himself. He didn't need to rush, his goal was simple: overwhelm Midoriya's control and break through to the bomb. But with each step, Midoriya countered, sending smaller waves of cold to disrupt Todoroki's ice. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. The temperature continued to drop, and Midoriya's vision blurred slightly from the exertion. His breaths were ragged, and the cold felt suffocating. But he couldn't stop now. Ochako glanced at him, concern in her eyes. "Izuku, are you okay?" Midoriya forced a smile, though his teeth were chattering. I'll be fine. We're almost there." The timer on the clock neared its end. Ida was only a few feet away from the bomb now, his engines roaring as he tried to push through. But just as he reached out to grab it, All Might's voice boomed through the facility. "Time! The villains win!" Midoriya's body slumped with relief. They had done it, they had held Todoroki and Ida off for the full 15 minutes. The cold was unbearable, but they had managed to out-strategize their opponents. Ochako beamed at him, giving him a thumbs up. "Izuku, we did it," she said, her voice filled with pride. Midoriya smiled weakly, his breath still visible in the cold air. "Why yeah. We did." As the teams regrouped, Todoroki gave Midoriya and Ūriqᴜᴜ an almost glare and turned away. Midoriya shivered slightly, still pulling his jacket tight around himself. Todoroki studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Midoriya smiled nervously, knowing that the next challenge would be even tougher. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had proven himself in the face of overwhelming power and walked away victorious. As the class dispersed, Midoriya couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. He had come a long way, and there was still so much more to learn. But for today, he had won.